This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate first part of what if Naruto makes Mizore fall in love with him. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And for more exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. And now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The village concealed in the leaves is home to Hashirama, the first Hokage of the Konoha. He was a formidable shinobi, and no one disputes that. Even his adversaries must acknowledge that he was a man deserving of respect, even though they perceive in him a force that ought to have been classified as a force of nature. He would be pictured by the average person as an unstoppable force that brought peace to the elemental nations. Whenever the Konoha people thought of him, they would think of a gift from God. Prior to him, the elemental nations were composed of numerous clans engaged in ceaseless conflict over territory and resources. Because battles were fought on a daily basis, bloodshed and suffering were commonplace. The Biju, tailed beasts, were the worst in spite of everything. They were enormously powerful creatures that could only be matched by another. They terrorized the people of the elemental nations as they roamed the land. The Uchiha and Senju clans followed. The only rivalry between the two ninja clans was between them. One was called upon to fight back when the other did. Then, one day, both clans made the decision that they could stand no more of the daily chaos and bloodshed. As a result, the leaders of the two clans met and reached a consensus. Any other human force in the world at the time would be unable to stop them from establishing a new system of villages. To determine who would rule the new village, they fought a single decisive battle that drained oceans and destroyed mountains. Hashirama ultimately prevailed, and Konoha Ayuro, the first hidden village Ayuro, was born beneath him. Then, using Fuinjutsu from a different clan and his Mokuton, which could defeat the great Biju, Hashirama sealed the Biju. While the other 8 were temporarily sealed into objects and sent to the 4 other hidden villages that had emerged shortly after Konoha, the strongest was sealed into his wife. According to Hashirama, this was done to foster peace and establish a balance of power among the elemental nations. Nobody, not even his own wife, had a different opinion. Mito Uzumaki, the wife of Hashirama Senju, knew differently. She was a member of the Uzumaki clan, who lived in Uzushiogakure, a village tucked away in the whirlpools. The Uzumaki clan was unknown to the elemental nations. They were aware of the Uzumaki's proficiency in Fuinjutsu, as well as their exceptional longevity and healing powers. That the Uzumaki were fiercely devoted to their village and would fight to the death to defend it. However, a lot of things were unknown. Uzumaki Mito was a member of the royal class of the Uzumaki. In actuality, the royal class was not human either. They were mythical creatures that existed before the gods and were capable of equaling the gods themselves. Creatures that would never really perish. When they felt they were no longer needed, the majority of these beings had long since gone to eternal sleep, but a small family of them was never able to sleep with the others. They made the decision to just observe the passing of time. They observed the rise and fall of civilizations, the mutual aid and destruction of races and species. Their familial ties to one another, however, remained constant throughout. As they observed, they came to the conclusion that, in general, people were depressing and repulsive beings who frequently engaged in pointless conflict. They therefore made the decision to step in when they saw a group of people who were different. A long time ago, a group of survivors and wanderers established a village on an island. They were people who always valued family and had challenging pasts. They thrived because they were isolated from the chaos that afflicted the rest of the world and from the other elemental nations at the time. All of them had previously participated in the mayhem but had escaped. They grew into a large family over time, which sparked the loyalty that would last for many generations. They were later discovered by a small ninja clan, whose ruthless and avaricious leader made the decision to turn them into slaves. They weren't ninja, let alone warriors. They lacked the resources to protect themselves from enemy ninja. They preyed as a result. They did not, however, completely leave their fates up to chance. To their credit, there was never any infighting after they armed themselves and prepared to face the enemy. Because family was the one thing they had always clung to and valued above all else. Luckily, a group of beings answered their prayer, so the plans they had made to repel the attackers were never put to the test. Inspired by their devotion to family, they concluded that such a thing needed to be safeguarded because it was too valuable to be destroyed by human greed. The day of the impending attack, the island was surrounded by enormous whirlpools that erupted. The tremendous pressure crushed the attackers, dragging them to the ocean's deepest depths where they had no chance. Ships were broken up and thrown far away, and enemy ninjas who were walking on water met their watery demise because they were unable to outpower the whirlpools. Massive creatures of fire surrounded the villagers who had gathered there and were ready to fight to the death. The fire-covered creatures assumed the shape of enormous birds. For several tense minutes, the firebirds hovered around the villagers, staring at them as if they were passing judgment on the people they had just rescued. All of the villagers tensed when one of the birds suddenly made a little cry. Then, as they froze and readied themselves for death, they were bathed in a brilliant light. Only to discover, moments later, that the fiery birds had been replaced by humanoid creatures of extraordinary grace and beauty. The people had been deemed worthy by the otherworldly beings. They taught the populace self-defense techniques and how to create more sophisticated systems while always keeping in mind their familial responsibilities. The people were also blessed by the phoenixes to have superior bodies to others, and they believed that fuinjutsu was a lost art to humanity. The villagers and the phoenixes grew so close over time that they were considered family. The phoenixes ultimately made the decision to remain in their human guises and establish themselves in the village. As a family, they chose to honor the event that had altered their destiny by naming the village Uzushiogakure, which is hidden in the whirlpools. The Uzumaki had maintained their core beliefs for many generations. Mito Uzumaki was aware that her husband was not the best person in the world for this reason as well. Despite being a phoenix and a member of the royal class, Mito was still too young for her species to fully utilize her abilities. Her people had stood by her after she fell in love with Hashirama, even after she left the island to marry her husband. She had pleaded with her husband to send Konoha troops to defend her birth village when Uzushiogakure was attacked by 3 other hidden villages. He had promised to send assistance. She was completely shocked and depressed to learn that her village had been overrun and destroyed. But throughout it all, Hashirama had never offered her any consolation. She eventually developed paranoia and suspicion. She once went to his office and, pretending that she wanted to spend the day with him, managed to get Hashirama to leave. After they left, she left a shadow clone of herself, who looked through the documents pertaining to Uzushiogakure. What she had discovered astounded her. Help had never been sent by Hashirama. When she confronted him about it, he became enraged and said something that completely shocked Mito. When you came here you became a part of the leaf and hence you should always put the leaf above all else. Uzushiogakure was nothing but a stepping stone for Konoha. Her husband had cruelly advised her. At that moment, their relationship was all but destroyed. Hashirama and Mito eventually got into a fight. Hashirama was on the verge of defeat near the end because even he was unable to defeat the immortal bird known as the Phoenix. But because she still harbored deep affection for Hashirama, Mito was unable to deliver the final blow. Hashirama only had to hesitate once. It seems that he had anticipated this event and had prepared one of her strongest weapons in advance. Mito was sealed inside the Shinigami after he called forth the Shinigami. The biggest error Mito made was to fall for Hashirama. But Hashirama wasn't pleased. Being an exceptionally strong and shrewd shinobi, Hashirama was aware that Konoha would eventually lose its dominance without the support of phoenixes. He thus spent years trying, with little success, to find a way to solidify Konoha's authority. That is, until he learned that a group of ninja had been dispatched to Uzushiogakure to seize anything valuable. A survivor had been discovered by the ninja. Hashirama knew he had discovered a different path as soon as he saw her. He had discovered another member of the nobility. Kushina Uzumaki was a phoenix. They held her deep beneath Konoha using seals stolen from the Uzumaki and worked to break her every day because he would have them help Konoha if he couldn't get them to do so voluntarily. She never broke, even though they tried every technique they knew. She held for decades and Hashirama's attempts were unsuccessful. After Hashirama was killed in combat, his brother Tobirama succeeded him after the second Hokage failed as well. Then Sarutobi Hiruzen, the third Hokage, appeared. Who chose Minato Namikaze as his successor after failing to break Kushina as well. Then, Minato would be the one to think of a plan that would use a phoenix as a devoted weapon for Konoha. After months of plotting together, they were certain they had a foolproof strategy. The initial stage, Kushina will be released and allowed to temporarily reside at the Hokage mansion when Minato Namikaze assumes the role of Hokage. Then persuade her that he truly regretted the actions of the previous Hokage. A certain redhead's eyes blinked open and she thought, soft. She froze as soon as she realized she was no longer in her cell. As soon as she sat up, she saw a blonde man with spiky hair who appeared to be dozing off by her bed. When she saw the Hokage hat on his head, she tensed instantly. The blonde picked this up as well. Kushina's expression changed from defiance to shock to disbelief to relief when she heard, "Don't worry, I'm not like my predecessors. In fact, I would like to apologize for all that they have done to you." As she clung to Minato and let out happy sobs, tears began to fall down her cheeks. The second stage. Minato will make an effort to win Kushina's affection and get married. They will then give birth to a child. Minato is supposed to tell Kushina some of the plan after she gives birth in order to make her destructive. To ensure that Kushina causes some damage, Minato will take her to a number of Konoha neighborhoods that are populated by civilians. Then, just as Hashiram did, Minato will vanquish her. The newlyweds enjoyed each other's company while sitting side by side on the Hokage mansion's roof. They had consummated their marriage after a few more. Kushina gave birth to a new child 9 months later. With a soft whisper, Kushina said, "Let me hold my Naruto." There was no answer for her. When she glanced at Minato's face, she saw a sly grin. "Finally I can stop this little charade. Your baby will be the perfect weapon for Konoha." Minato sneered, mocking Kushina's predicament. Kushina changes into a phoenix as he had predicted, but she becomes enraged because of the betrayal and despair. Before the fourth Hokage, defeated, the demon bird that had attacked their village, the cries of villagers being burned alive resounded throughout the night. The third stage involves Minato making the baby's life in Konoha miserable by anticipating the villagers' response. After that, Sarutobi will care for the infant and coerce it into becoming Konoha's faithful weapon. As he held up a baby for the village to see, the fourth Hokage yelled, "Konoha, contrary to what many of you believe, I have not killed the demon. Instead, I have only succeeded in weakening it and trapping it into the form of a child. However, the demon child must not be killed because if he is killed, he will regain its powers and kill us all." That marked the beginning of Naruto Uzumaki's extremely difficult upbringing. A blond boy with tears in his eyes whispered, "Why Gigi?" The villagers are simply grieving Naruto. Remember, the demon that attacked them 7 years ago hurt many of them. Do not blame them for it. Unfortunately, you remind them of the demon. Try and forgive them, the Sarutobi said in a gentle voice. It was intended to solidify Konoha's dominance by transforming the infant into their greatest weapon. There were less appealing options in case the plan didn't work out or the demon child wasn't faithful to Konoha. Seals were applied to the child as soon as he was born. By placing seals on the child, the Hokage was able to limit the child's human and phoenix abilities. They would allow the Hokage to always be aware of the child's whereabouts and, in the event that the child ever threatened Konoha, to kill them. In a way, the plan was ideal. It should have ensured that Konoha had a strong weapon, but because of their avarice, humans had greatly underestimated monsters and demons. Even the best laid plans never worked out the way they were supposed to, and plans often go wrong. The boy was in the Forest of Death on Naruto's 8th birthday. Every year on his birthday, when the beatings were at their worst, he made plans to hide there from the villagers. He had located a cave and stocked it with enough provisions to last several weeks. He could only hope that no one discovered him now. Unfortunately for him, Konoha's snake mistress was enlisted to track him down this year in order to avoid any issues with the Konoha Council. Finding a blonde who isn't trained in stealth was easy for Anko, Konoha's snake mistress, who resides in the Forest of Death. Before he could even scream, Naruto was rendered helpless by the venom of multiple snakes that had bitten into his skin. "Die, demon scum!" Naruto screamed in agony as he discovered a katana buried in his stomach up to its hilt. In the middle of the forest, he was tied to a stake, and he was surrounded by ninja and civilian villagers. As they rushed in to get a piece of the demon brat, everyone had sneers and cruel smirks on their faces. After 15 minutes, the boy was surrounded by an Anbu squad, and the crowd stopped. Because the Hokage directly oversaw Anbu, which were elite ninja. Unfortunately, the squad swiftly turned to face the boy and began making a series of hand signals, replacing the villagers' uncertainty with joy. When the Anbu team yelled, "Kaden, Ga Kakia, no Jutsu, Fire Style, Fireball Jutsu," they were all together. The crowds chanting and cheering for the demon's death soon followed. A phoenix was a legendary bird of fire, which was unfortunate for them. Smoke had filled the air from the fireballs that had been thrown at the boy. Strangely, nobody paid attention to the demon's cries of agony. Surprisingly, Naruto was unharmed by the fire. Did I simply take in the flames? Naruto thought. Naruto's birth seals were broken by the power he acquired from the fire. Then Naruto's body was filled with a sense of accomplishment, power, and euphoria. When the civilians and ninjas sensed an unchecked power surge from the demon's center, they all stopped. Subsequently, a second pulse emerged, this one even more powerful, creating a crater around the center. More pulses soon followed, each one more powerful than the last. The pulses stopped before the crowd even considered running. After that, there was a flaming explosion that could have destroyed the entire forest, and some people emerged from the center. Everyone was apprehended, and those who were caught were merely burned to the ground. The ninjas' metal equipment even melted into the surroundings. Then, inside the first explosion, there was another. This one covered a third of Konoha and was much bigger. Suddenly, what appeared to be a tear appeared at the explosion's source. and a small child's body was drawn in. The tear then vanished as if it had never happened. Somewhere else in the world, far away. A new phoenix with a strikingly similar energy signature to their own was sensed by a family of phoenixes. They immediately set out to find what might be a missing family member. Sitting on a plain blue mat, Surara and Mizore Shirayuki consumed shaved ice slowly. They relished their solitude as they silently observed the horizon. The village they lived in was perched atop one of the mountains in front of them, creating a lovely scenery. On a broad stretch of level ground, they were on a mountain, close to the summit. They both wore plain white kimonos despite the snow-covered mountain. A violet obiage, 2, a Byzantium, 1, obi, 3, and an indigo obi. Jaime, 4, held Sarera's kimono, which featured a violet, blue line through the collar, together. Mizore wore a knee-length kimono with a red, violet collar and a simple obi of the same color that held it together. In fact, they found the temperature to be quite comfortable. This was how they usually liked to spend their time together, and they were having a mother-daughter day. They were quite happy to just sit and observe. Their thoughts calmed down and became free of negativity. Until, 20 meters away, what looked like a tear just materialized in front of them. Startled, they quickly stood up as their muscles stiffened, and after exchanging a quick look, they made the decision to approach the tear cautiously. As they moved in positions that would allow them to counterattack in the event of an emergency, Surara thought, if there is even the slightest chance that this might be a danger to our village, then I'll have to deal with it. They were approaching the tear, slowly and with stoic expressions, when an energy surge burst from it. The region surrounding the tear then began to warm up. Around it, the snow was beginning to melt. Because Surara is more heat resistant, she managed her breathing and swiftly removed a sucker, placed it in her mouth, and her body temperature dropped. Unfortunately, Mizore, her daughter, fell to her hands and knees because she was not as heat resistant as she was. Hot. Mizore began to perspire, and she was becoming weaker by the moment. She began to breathe heavily and her vision began to blur. Her limbs were beginning to feel heavy, and she said, "It's too hot." But Surara moved fast, using her mastery of ice to chill the area around Mizore. She then unwrapped another sucker and put it in her daughter's mouth. In a stoic tone, Surara asked her daughter, "Better now, dear?" "Yes." "Arigato, haha." Mizore responded in a similarly stoic manner as she slowly stood up, keeping her breathing under control and being aware of her body's condition. Following that, both Yuki, Ona returned to the tear, this time prepared with their cryokinesis 5 skills. The snow surrounding the tear had melted completely, and as they approached, they saw a massive puddle beneath it that was roughly the size of a huge pond. Even more startlingly, the water directly beneath the tear was beginning to boil, indicating to her daughter to remain in her current location for her own protection. After a few seconds of observing the tear, Surara proceeded to the pond's edge and made the decision to use her powers to cool the area. It didn't work. In fact, it seemed to make the area hotter. Suddenly, Surara sensed a significant accumulation of demonic energy. "What is this?" she said, her eyes widening. Her normally stoic expression gave way to one of fear. Observing that her daughter's expression changed from one of stoicism to one of fear. "Masumi, brace yourself." Surara yelled in a terrified tone as her leg muscles tensed up. As she ran, she accumulated as much yukai as she could, and as soon as she got to her daughter, she used all of her energy to create an ice barrier that would keep them away from the tear. The barrier itself was roughly 3 meters thick and was composed of the densest ice Surara could create. The tear let out a massive burst of energy and fired just a second later. With both hands on the ice barrier, Surara focused all of her remaining energy on keeping the barrier intact in the face of the flaming energy assault. A little more, she mentally repeated Surara. The strain of the task was causing her hands to shake, and she was breathing heavily as perspiration trickled down her face. Surara collapsed onto the now rocky ground as soon as the explosion stopped, gasping for air. It was too close. Mizore quickly recovered from her shock and hurried to her mother's side. In order to hasten her mother's recovery, she used her own control over ice to freeze the immediate vicinity of both of them. 5 minutes later, Surara was able to stand on wobbly legs with the assistance of her daughter. Now that the ice barrier was only 10 centimeters thick, they moved slowly around it. It was now a crater in front of them. But because the mountain's rock was so hard, even though the surrounding area was dry and snow-free, the crater was smaller than it would have been if the explosion had occurred on regular soil. A young boy was at the bottom of the crater, which was only a meter deep. "It is a boy, and he is naked," Mizore thought this when she first saw a naked boy who wasn't from her village. After cautiously descending the crater, they could see that the boy was probably around Mizore's age and had spiky blonde hair. The boy had no visible wounds and appeared to be in perfect health. Surara and Mizore, however, were both aware of the boy's elevated body temperature and the lingering energy surrounding him. Was that big energy explosion caused by the boy? How does he feel human? Surara squinted. In any case, we can't just leave him here in case he dies. Surara said, Mizore, we'll bring the boy with us. Mizore complied by using her skills to create a basic ice craft, which they then pulled the boy onto. The ice then melted when it came into contact with the boy. What on earth just took place? Surara's suspicions grew. No human should be able to melt our ice, from skin contact no less. Even if his body was tainted by residual yukai. Surara gave the order, Mizore, use denser and more resistant ice. Mizore fixed the human-shaped hole in the craft with denser ice while maintaining mental focus and breathing control. Getting the boy back on the craft again, while Surara and Mizore also joined in. The craft itself is not very complicated. A pair of ice skis on each side supported the flat base, which was a rectangle with a triangle joining it in front to form a tip. The back of the craft was a little higher than the sides, which were curved. The craft's gunnel was rounded. Mizore stood in the back, placing her mother on one side and the boy on the other. She spread her legs slightly and bent her knees. She cleared her head and imagined what she would do. She supported the craft by using her cryokinesis to lift a thin layer of ice close to the back of the skis. The craft began to move forward after gravity took care of the rest. The craft accelerated as she repeated this with quick flicks of her wrists. They were aware of only one doctor in their village. After 5 minutes, they ran into issues. Mizore slowed the craft down and began to look around, asking, haha, blizzards don't usually form this quickly, so how come? Surara, who was well enough to stand by herself, responded to her own query, the energy just now, the explosion might have caused it. Find somewhere for us to take shelter, Musume. Even if we can stand the cold, he might not be able to. Not to mention you'll have a hard time steering through the blizzard. Hi, was Mizore's response. She had just noticed a nearby cave, so she subtly twisted her torso to change their direction. The blizzard began to hit them as soon as they arrived at the cave. As the craft came to a halt, Mizore eased her breathing and shifted into a more comfortable standing position. After approaching the boy's sides, the two Yuki, Ona raised an arm and wrapped it around their shoulders. They enter the cave slowly. When they are completely inside, they push the boy up against the cave's wall, and Surara creates an ice wall to block the cave's entrance. Protected from the weather, they both take a seat and relax. Surara or Mizore would check on the boy sitting on an ice table every 10 minutes. Mizore would chill the cave because they had discovered some time ago that Naruto's body generated enough heat to cause the icy walls to melt a little. If the cave fell on them, that would not be good. Surara relied on her daughter because she still lacked sufficient energy. The cave was still filled with the sounds of the blizzard. My Musume meets hundreds, thousands, even millions of boys, and the first one who is not from the village just popped out of nowhere. Surara thought to herself with a hint of humor and melancholy, even in the village, she has no friends her age. I was fortunate that later in our marriage, Yatashi and I fell in love. To ensure our survival, a great number of us were compelled to enter into loveless marriages. Surara's legs were together and bent at the knees, her arms were at ease, and her shoulders hung loosely. Mizore will also have to get married in a few more years unless she finds love before then. I remember our first date, we were so nervous Thina euro hee euro. She might develop a bond with that boy. Surara concluded with a mental chuckle as a soft smile replaced the faint frown that had been on her face. She seems concerned about the boy and she has checked on him tirelessly every 10 minutes since I did the first few times a euro. Now I just have to make sure the boy is worthy of my Musume. We used to watch the sunset quite a bit. Holding hands. Just enjoying each other's presence, Surara said, gazing at her daughter and the boy with ease. By his side, her daughter was watching him with a mildly concerned look. After a few moments, Mizore gently placed her hand on the boy's head and withdrew it. Her daughter gently moved the boy into a more comfortable position, saying, he feels very warm though. I'm not sure this is normal even if he is a human. Ah. The boy's lips uttered soft groans of pain. He scrounged up his face. Is he experiencing nightmares? Perhaps if I, Mizore, placed a consoling hand on the boy's face. As if it had never happened, the boy's face leaned into hers and gradually relaxed. Mizore leaned closer to examine his face more closely. The boy's eyes opened a little abruptly. He said, Tenshi, 6, a euro, before closing his eyes again. Mizore resisted the urge to pet his whiskers, thinking, now that I actually think about it, he's quite cute, especially those whisker marks. What was once a third of Konoha was circled by two small red birds. They were anything but typical birds. The crater was enormous, extending at least 10 meters below the surface. There was Konoha on one side of the crater and forest on the other. It appears that the Hokage Tower was only 5 meters from the crater's edge. However, it seemed that the village had constructed a stone wall on the side to create a makeshift border around what was left of the village. After finishing their survey, they approached the explosion center gradually. Where the strongest residual energy was found, of course, there were benefits to being just over 1.8 thousand years old, like a wealth of knowledge. This energy is similar, but it's also different. They noticed indications that a dimensional rift had formed there and said, looks like the huge release of energy also ripped a hole between two dimensions. I can feel the distorted nature energy. They took off after learning the dimensional rift's residual energy by heart, to somewhere safer than where they were going to do it. Returning home to get ready for their brief journey in their humanoid forms. They descended to the lowest floor and entered a plain-looking room. However, upon closer examination, the room's walls would have invisible seals, strengthening the space beyond what could be achieved with just materials. However, they went to another room that was similarly reinforced before they began. They gazed longingly at each other. Then they left the room containing their daughter's egg, saying, "We'll be back soon, Masumi. She would not be reborn for a few more years." They then went inside and closed off the space where they were going to create a stable dimensional rift. The room experienced a tremendous energy surge, but the seals performed their duty and kept the surge in check. Before long, a wooden door framed a stable rift in front of them. The door shut behind them as they entered the rift. In the midst of a blizzard, a wooden door materialized on snowy ground. Two humanoid creatures emerged as the door opened. The door closed again and vanished as soon as the two were out of it. The woman shivered in response to the man's statement, "Even after so many years and despite our strength, the cold still gets us unless we consciously control our body's temperature. We'll need to locate one of our own quickly if they're present. This is a terrible environment for our species if proper training and supervision are not provided." After a brief pause, they continued their activities without considering the impact of the blizzard. Every piece of snow and ice that struck them instantly turned to steam. Any physical tracks they could have followed would have likely been erased by the blizzard. Fortunately for them, they were monitoring a particular energy source. Got it. His energy signature is sticking out like a sore thumb. Looks like there are two other weaker signature around him. Her companion added, "Yeah, their energy feels cold too." After bending their knees slightly, they leapt into the air. After that, they transformed back into tiny birds and flew, but this time, the birds were primarily white and blended in with their surroundings. At speeds that should have been impossible for typical birds, they flew toward their target. Unless the birds fly directly in front of one's face, a bystander wouldn't even notice anything. Their target was beneath the snow when they came to a halt halfway down the mountain. With slightly glowing beaks, the birds dove. The snow just melted away when they hit it, and they proceeded with their underground dive. Until they struck a solid layer of ice, that is. It seems that demonic energy was used to strengthen the ice. This could go wrong because water and ice were still their natural weaknesses, but it would take a very strong person because of how strong they were. Both of their eyes narrowed at this. A thin layer of ice, everything below is tainted snow. They turned back into their humanoid forms and put both of their hands on the ground without exchanging glances. They prepared their arms while breathing deliberately. They began to melt through the ice and the contaminated snow with a little concentration and demonic energy. Mizore became concerned when she sensed the melting of her cave's reinforcements. This immediately caught Sarera's attention. "Haha, something or someone is melting the snow and ice above us." She swiftly extended her senses into her daughter's eyes and validated her feelings. "Yukai. They are unquestionably connected to fire, regardless of who or what they are. Let's see how strong they are." She stood up, concentrated, and strengthened the remaining ice with her own energy. Mother and daughter both moved in front of the area where the object or persons melting the ice would be when it was eventually broken through, once it became evident that the ice was still melting. They surrounded the area where the hole would form with a thick, transparent, cylindrical wall of ice. In a matter of seconds, two figures fell from the ceiling, and soon the water began to drip from the top of the cylinder. The two figures turned to face them and extended their senses. Luckily for the two, the Yuki Onna in front of them was far less powerful than they were. They made the decision to just approach them by walking through the ice. "This is not good, they're very powerful, that's for sure." Surara then tried to freeze them in the barrier, But despite her best efforts, the two would simply continue to move forward, neither accelerating nor decelerating. When the two creatures were free of the ice, they just stopped. Surara waved her daughter behind her, saying, "Even though we have the advantage here, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference to these two." She spread her legs slightly and tensed her muscles before releasing her yukai. Her hands turned into ice claws, and her hair gradually turned to ice. She bent her back slightly, her muscles tense and her eyebrows furrowed. She put her hands in front of her, feeling as prepared as she would ever be in that circumstance. The male said, "We're not here to fight you, Yuki, Ona." His voice was wiser than his actual age would suggest. His red hair was short. He was dressed in a plain gray, black shirt with silver stripes down the sides and white rims. His shirt had a phoenix emblem on the front and a yellow collar. The sleeves were orange at the ends. He was wearing black trousers with red rings evenly spaced on each side. His companion was dressed in an ankle-length dress. To make movement easier, the dress featured slits on both sides that extended up to the mid-thigh. The dress had phoenix emblems sewn into it and was a dull red color. The dress had a silver collar. Both the sleeves and the dress's ends were tipped black. She had on black biker shorts underneath. "I'm Kazushi Uzumaki and beside me my wife, Miyuki Uzumaki. We're here for that boy behind you," said Kazushi. Even though Surara was aware that she would likely lose to someone who could melt her ice so easily, she still felt compelled to shield the boy because she had no idea what the two wanted from him. She never altered her stance. As she recalled the customs of her village, Surara thought, besides, he is the first boy from outside the village that Mizore has met, and it's so obvious Mizore is starting to connect with the boy. It was difficult to find true love in her village, where they were forced to marry young. Even if it meant preserving her daughter's one chance at love, she would defend the boy and her daughter. Surara asked stoically, "Why do you want with the boy?" But if one was seasoned, they would be able to pick up on the underlying fear in her voice. "What we want is to check something that is personal. Besides, what are you doing with the boy?" replied the man once more. His friend had already begun to approach the boy. Surara immediately reassessed the circumstances. With his hands by his sides and his slow breathing, Kazushi appeared to be quite at ease, but she could tell that he could quickly react if necessary. She looked at the other woman and saw that her arms were held loosely at her sides, and her steps were purposeful and short. She would be able to defend herself and swiftly change the direction of her body in such a position. Then her eyes widened, showing worry and fear, and she froze. Beads of sweat were starting to form on her face as she fought the urge to rush over and defend. With her hands clenched and extended, Mizore stood in front of Miyuki, obstructing her path. Mizore's entire body was rigid and her eyes were squeezed shut. Surara exclaimed, "Mizore! What are you doing?" with a good deal of anxiety and fear at her daughter's carelessness. The two women were undoubtedly aware of each other's reactions. These two were definitely something. They've probably only had him for a day or so, and already they're protecting him. That or our deceased family members work quickly even when they're asleep, Kazushi thought, stifling a twisted laugh. Kazushi said in a clearer, softer voice, "Calm down, we won't hurt him, and we believe we know who he is and how to help him." When Miyuki arrived at the smaller Yuki, Ona, she smiled warmly. She gently persuaded Mizore to open her eyes by raising the young girl's chin. Miyuki muttered, "Clam down, I won't do anything bad, okay?" "Okay, Yuro." She put a reassuring hand on the Yuki, Ona's shoulder and gently helped her settle into a more comfortable position next to the boy. When Surara saw this, she was able to reduce her anxiety to the point where she was able to regain most of her physical control. She maintained a slightly more relaxed posture by lowering her arms and regaining her stoic expression. It appeared to onlookers that Miyuki had placed her free hand on the boy's forehead. To assess the boy's health, she was injecting him with tiny packets of her yukai. She took off her hands and spoke after a short while. "He is a phoenix, albeit a very young one, as we had anticipated. He even shares our energy signature. He is unquestionably a member of our family," Miyuki thought. Her deep, melodic voice filled the cave as she said, "He's fine. His body is just exhausted, he just needs to rest a bit more and he should be up by tomorrow. Do you know where we could find a comfortable place for him to rest?" Surara clamped her hand over Mizore's mouth as she shot her mother a dirty, inquisitive look. "Our village is just a euro," Mizore said. Kazushi appeared to be sufficiently aware of her intentions. Kazushi then moved to a wall and, concentrating some energy, tapped it once with the tips of his fingers. "It is fine. You don't want to tell the location of your people to outsiders, much less strangers you just met. We understand." The wooden door that led them here reappeared in the wall just as it had vanished. Miyuki picked the boy up gently and carried him over to the door. Before the man opened the door, Surara was a little perplexed by his actions. The tear she and her daughter had seen earlier today was similar to what was behind the door, but it appeared more stable. What kind of power do these two possess that he would so casually create something like that? Surara remained stoic as she thought, somewhat shocked. Mizore, on the other hand, was a little less aware because she had to deliberately stop her body from following the boy because her eyes were fixed on him the entire time. Kazushi saw the stress in the younger girl's body and took note of it once more. Kazushi told the two Yuki, "Ona, you're welcome to come with us if you want. For caring for our family member, even when we are unaware of it." Surara could see that Mizore was genuinely interested in going with the boy, even though the question was more aimed at her. Besides, it's not like they can really do anything bad without us noticing. She gave in after seeing her daughter's beseeching eyes for another second. Well, they could have killed us at any time if they wanted us dead. As she pushed her daughter forward, Surara thought, might as well. The mother and daughter approached the door and entered the rift without hesitation, maintaining a stoic expression the entire time. Kazushi quickly trailed behind, but not before noting the spot for later use, and the door vanished as soon as it closed once more. As the circumstances became more apparent, Sarutobi Hiruzen, the third Hokage, cursed. Problem after problem just kept coming up right after the catastrophe. He had sent nearly all of his Anbu to secure the affected area when the explosion finally stopped. Then, in order to maintain control over the civilian population, he had to send Junin and Shunin, which caused a great deal of opposition from the civilian council. The genin were supposed to patrol the village as scouts. Regretfully for him, the explosion affected the majority of Konoha's economic sector. This meant that the village's military would be underfunded in addition to requiring him to borrow money from the daimyo. In order to protect himself from hostile countries, he would also need to send his ninja on constant missions. Since everything in the area was vaporized, it was also nearly impossible to determine what caused the catastrophe. The issue of the village's weapon then arises. The explosion also destroyed Naruto Uzumaki's apartment, and it was assumed that the boy was dead. There was no response from his tracking seals. What have I done to merit this? Sarutobi sighed and thought. Then one of his worst headaches arrived as the door opened. Hiruzen, what has happened? Asked Danzo Shimura, an elderly man with only one visible eye and an arm in a cast that required him to use a walking stick with his free hand. Kaharu Udatane and Homura Mitokado, two elders, were behind him. Hiruzen sighed and took his pipe out of his mouth. An explosion has wiped out a third of Konoha. The economy sector of the village is the worst off. With a frown on her face, Kaharu asked distastefully, how could such a thing have happened? Hiruzen stood up and gazed out the window at the crater, saying, unfortunately there is still no clear lead on what caused it. The blast incinerated everything and anyone had touched. It is impossible to gather evidence. Even he would have been a victim that day if it had gone a little farther. With a serious expression on his face, Homura asked, then what of the Anbu patrols? After all, village security was in jeopardy if there were insufficient patrols. This might have seemed like a straightforward excuse to anyone else, but to the three other elders present, the hidden meaning was evident. Despite all their training, ninjas still have emotions. That day they were celebrating the demon bird's defeat and unfortunately grieving over their losses. They were all members of the group that attacked Naruto Uzumaki. Danzo, the presumed former leader of Root, responded, that's why you should have never disbanded my Root Foundation. Looking at the pictures of the previous two Hokages of the Leaf, Hiruzen said, I will not have my ninja without emotion. Those that lack emotion lack the will of fire. I will not throw away my predecessors' teachings and beliefs. He wished they were still alive to address this. If you're Nina Euro, we are not going to discuss something that I decided years ago, Danzo. Hiruzen intervened. Hiruzen asked suspiciously, what are you really here for? Because he was starting to get a headache. All right, Danzo said, what about our village weapon? He has been pursuing Naruto since the boy's birth, sigh. It's the same old Danzo. Unfortunately for him, I had already planned. Sarutobi smirked to himself. But that quickly vanished when he realized that Naruto and his plans were probably also destroyed in the blast. Hiruzen turned to face Danzo and said, the boy's apartment was caught in the blast and he has yet to be found. The man was unfazed by it. Danzo tapped his walking cane lightly on the ground with his one good arm and said, so the village's weapon is missing or dead. This would have never had happened if you just gave me custody of the boy in the first place. This information has to be suppressed, if the other villagers catch wind of Thisa Euro, said Homura. It would be a disaster. We are the only great village without a demon weapon. We would lose a major deterrent. Every other great village has at least two Jinchuriki. 1. Yet we the strongest do not even have one. We lost the Kyuubi when it broke out of its seal a few years ago in the Third Shinobi War. We almost lost the war if not for the Yondaime, too. Hokage. Kaharu continued. It was hard enough staying the strongest village without a Jinchuriki, then came the demon bird and you had a lucky break. Homura was resumed. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes and corrected, do not assume that I do not know that. The village had a lucky break when the demon bird attacked and we managed to seal it into one of ours. However, the elders' expressions showed that they didn't give a damn. Yet you lose our only real deterrent against the other, great villages. Your old age has gotten to you, Hiruzen. Pick another successor and be done with it, Danzo said. Hiruzen dodged the question, one of many he would face, and then glanced at the clock. At this point picking a new Hokage will not get us a new Jinchuriki. Hiruzen merely walked past his advisors with heavy steps, saying, now if you excuse I have to go to a meeting, please leave. I believe we have to take things into our own hands seeing that our Hokage obviously cannot solve this in an effective way, Danzo said. I agree. So do I. When the leaves of a tree are rotten and useless, one has to remove them. For as long as there exists the roots, the tree will recover, Danzo said with determination. The advisors to the Hokage then completely abandoned their Hokage. 5 people emerged through a wooden door at the lowest level of the Phoenix's mansion. There were faintly glowing lines and kanji that formed seals on the room's walls. The seals stopped glowing as soon as the door was shut. Just before leaving, Miyuki said, well then, I'll take the boy to a spare room. Kazushi joked with the two Yuki. Ona, well then I guess I'll have to give you two the grand tour. However, there was a hint of exhaustion in his tone. He raised his hand and brushed back a few strands of hair. He paused, inhaled deeply, and sighed before saying, we're currently in one of our reinforced rooms at the bottom level of our mansion. His forehead was furrowed, and his face appeared a little tense. Man, this little day's worth of adventure was tiring compared to how we've been for years, Kazushi thought as he inhaled deeply and got ready to go on. Surara cut him off. With a slight smile, Surara said politely, you seem tired, why don't you take a rest and we explore on our own? Kazushi put his hand to his chin and appeared to consider this for a moment, weighing the advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, I would be giving two strangers free reign in our house. I'll be sleeping on the other, but our house's seals will alert us if something significant occurs. Okay, but there are some things you two should know. 1. Don't enter any other rooms on this level. 2. Don't try to use the rift we just used to get here without telling either me or Miyuki first. 3. If you require privacy or wish to stay here for the night, the two of you may use one of the guest rooms. The doors to the guest rooms are all single doors, gray and framed by a darker shade of gray, said Kazushi as he crossed out each one using his fingers. Surara and Mizore bowed slightly and Surara said, thank you for your hospitality, Kazushi-san. With a simple bow of his head, Kazushi left the room and the two Yuki, Ona by themselves. You're welcome, but please just call me Kazushi, I'm not one for formalities. You young hatchling, who are you? Your energy signature is quite similar to Kushina's, but it differs slightly from ours. What's more intriguing is that you seem to have some human in you too, Miyuki thought, gazing longingly at the boy she had just put to bed. Despite her best efforts, she was unable to firmly grasp the idea that there was something about him that resonated with her. Miyuki left the room and, like her husband, made the decision to go to bed. There were numerous doors leading to guest rooms on either side of the hallway she was traversing. She noticed the two house guests as she got closer to the end of the hallway that led to the main room. Oddly enough, the two were facing a guest room door when Miyuki stopped in front of them and said, hi. The handle of the door was frozen over. A tiny, amused smile appeared on her face. Having troubles with the door? As she and her mother turned to look at Miyuki, Mizore answered, yes, Kazushi-san said we could use one of the guest rooms but the door won't open no matter what we do. Mizore appeared somewhat agitated, but Sarera's face was beaming. Mizore's eyes went back to the door, obscured by her long hair. Miyuki chuckled as Mizore glared at the door, saying, that lazy husband of mine probably neglected to tell you that in order to use a room you have to both place your palms on that brown box next to it for a few seconds. As they both put their palms on the box, Surara questioned, what does it do? It locks in your energy signature and your palm print, so only the two of you can open the door. Although me and my husband can still override that. Miyuki anticipated their reactions, saying, then comes the amazement, shock, and surprise. Thank you Miyuki-san. Both guests entered the room after saying that. Miyuki's wrist twitched slightly in irritation as she stood there. I'm losing my touch, or it's because of their Yuki, Ona. Hey, at least the younger one had a little astonishment in her eyes. Miyuki thought about asking her husband if her abilities had really declined that much. The decline in her abilities could have been exploited by him. As Surara surveyed the alleged guest room, she thought, this is very furnished for a guest room. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a rather large, comfortable looking bed, and a television screen at one end of the room. However, the wallpaper was simply white. However, the window a euro. More especially, the view a euro, was what truly drew their attention. According to Surara, there is just a little bit of land and forest, maybe a kilometer or 2 or 3, and then nothing, not even a slope down that would hint at them being on a mountain or even a plateau, just sky. Where precisely are we? Something this large can't be floating in the air, so we can't be. Both of their eyes widened and their jaws fell. Despite gravity and their wide, open mouths, their suckers remained in their mouths, defying all the laws of physics. After a brief pause, Surara composed herself. She glanced at her daughter and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow in mild jealousy. Her daughter had recovered from their shock more quickly than she had. Mizore was now examining a tiny panel on one of the panels in the room. In her dimension, it bore a striking resemblance to control panels that Surara had seen in the human world. The brown boxes were tiny, about the width of a finger. Labels were above them. Well, lock room, lights, window curtains, temperature, clock, and, wait, a euro, temperature. As she approached, Surara touched a box with a down arrow next to the temperature label with her index finger. Before long, the temperature in the room was low enough for snow to fall. In fact, some of the water moisture in the air began to freeze. All Mizore could do was gaze at her mother's secret delight at creating a cozy atmosphere. A certain blonde began to stir at midnight. He saw an unfamiliar ceiling when he opened his crystal blue eyes. I'm lying on a softer bed with no springs jabbing at me. The air smells clean, and the ceiling looks different. After the beating in the forest, am I in the hospital? No, neither the white ceiling nor the disinfectant odor are present. Where am I? Naruto concluded by looking around in a slightly panicked manner. Well, this is a really well-furnished room. Why would a villager put me in such a lovely room if they wanted to kill me? Naruto pondered, a little perplexed. Perhaps I should take a look around. He stood up and surveyed his surroundings, placing his legs lightly on the ground out of concern for any pain. Then he felt his naked body being brushed by air. Where have my clothes gone to? Naruto was about to search the entire room for something that would help him keep his dignity. When he noticed a set of neatly folded clothes on a table next to his sleeping quarters, he felt foolish. I've never worn a better outfit in my life. He was happy with his attire, which included a black shirt with a red swirl on the back and gray tapered pants. It's not horribly orange too. He crept silently over to the door and opened it, to show a rather gloomy hallway that is only partially illuminated by moonlight entering through the window at its terminus. Naruto was walking down the hallway when he noticed a girl with purple hair staring at him with a hint of curiosity. Naruto eventually found the exit after much confusion. He felt a slight sting when he put his hand on the latch, but it vanished as soon as the door opened. However, he didn't appear to notice it. There was a single gravel pathway at the mansion's side that wound through a wall of trees, and the exterior appeared to be fairly typical. Around him was a sizable area of land encircled by a dense tree wall. Naruto couldn't help but notice that the clouds appeared to be a little lower than normal as he looked up at the lunar moon. Additionally, he never saw a certain Ona leave the door. Naruto decided to venture into the forest in an attempt to locate himself. He couldn't quite place it, but there was something strange about the place. Naruto instantly spun around and looked around after saying, crunch. Ordinary people would have ridden this off as a forest trick, but Naruto wasn't like that. When he was younger, he had disregarded such things, but after someone jumped out at him, he regretted it. Naruto yelled into the forest, come out, I know you're there. Abruptly, he sensed someone behind him. He jumped around quickly, taking in his stalker. She had pupilless eyes, long purple hair, and was roughly his height. Naruto shifted one leg behind him and raised his hands a little, asking suspiciously, who are you? Why are you following me? She appears oddly familiar. Mizore looked at the floor while she played with her fingers. I'm Mizore Shirayuki. I was following you because I was curious. However, Naruto wasn't really listening to her. She appears to be an angel with the moon behind her and her white kimono a euro. Wait. Angel? Naruto muttered, Tenshi. However, Mizore caught it. After all, if she couldn't spy on possible lovers, how could she? As she looked up at the boy, her cheeks began to flush a little. Naruto looked directly into her blue eyes and relaxed his arms a little, asking, did you save me? Well, not quite, but you were found unconscious and taken with my mother and me. Mizore gave the boy a slight smile and said, Arigato. However, there was something about him that moved her. Do you want to be friends with me? Naruto gazed down with uncertain eyes. I would like that, Naruto-san. Mizore gave a small nod, then used her hand to gently put some of her back into position. However, Mizore was unprepared when she felt two arms encircling her and repeatedly heard the words, thank you. She hesitated for a moment before returning the hug, saying, he feels warm. Warm. When Naruto eventually released the hug, Mizore appeared weak and exhausted, with her eyes slightly closed. Are you all right? Concerned for his new friend, Naruto inquired. It was quite chilly at night. I just can't stand the heat, that's all. Naruto looked at her in shock. She's joking, right? She doesn't look she's joking though. She did feel very cold. Naruto chose to just go along because he didn't want to lose his first true friend. Naruto, are you up for a stroll? Despite the numerous persistent questions, Naruto and Mizore felt rather contented throughout the walk. For the first time in his life, Naruto felt rather happy, finally making a friend. He nodded his response to Mizore's attempt to change the subject, albeit hesitantly, and the two new friends strolled in unison around the forest. Both children had small smiles on their faces, which neither of them knew. In front of them, the ground literally ended a few meters later, leaving only air. When they eventually cleared the clearing 10 minutes later, a rather large shock had instantly brought back all the questions Naruto had for the girl. So I just appeared out of nowhere, and after you and your mother saved me, two extremely strong strangers who said they knew who I was brought us all here. Mizore's shoulders were locked and tense, as explaining a few things to Naruto would do to someone, especially if she had to repeat some things up to a dozen times. She simply nodded stiffly as Naruto summarized what she had told him over a very long period of time. After staring at her for a while in shock, Naruto decided to trust her because there was something about her that spoke to him deeply. So, Mizore, tell me about your life. Naruto turned to face the moon. Well, I grew up in a village secret to humans, Mizore said, dropping her shoulders and twirling the sucker in her mouth. I never really made any friends, even though there were a lot of people my age. Why is that? The time that we Yuki Onna are fertile is comparatively brief, between our mid-teens and midpoint 20s. Therefore, even if it's an arranged marriage, we are all married at the age of 17 to ensure the survival of our race. That's a euro, Naruto interrupted. Because of this, many of us wish to find our loves before then. Don't a euro? Mizore's eyes faltered a little. We would rather marry someone we know than a complete stranger, so that means we have to fight over boys. Even worse, we occasionally have to romance humans because Yuki Otoko are extremely rare. As Mizore thought back to her early years, sadness began to creep up on her. I was different from the other girls. I wasn't particularly hostile. Thus, the others constantly denigrated me. Mizore cast a sidelong glance at this. His eyes are the same as mine. Loneliness, hurt, and pain most people never understand, yet his eyes seem so deep, I feel like I could get lost in them. She gasped as two fingers lifted her chin to meet Naruto's eyes. I understand, but we won't be by ourselves any longer. I take it that we're friends? Even though the Yuki Onna nodded at such a simple act, both of them shed tears as they gave each other a hug. I was always alone and shunned in my village. I was constantly teased by the adults. As Naruto reopened old but new wounds, he found solace in her embrace. Then they would reward their children for beating me. Knowing that they had at last found a friend who understood them made their embrace even tighter. The worst part was that I never even knew why. Mizore's relationship with the blonde only grew closer. Unbeknownst to one another, they had made the same mental vow at the same time. I promise you, Naruto, Mizore, I will never leave you. Mizore, however, found herself breaking off the embrace as soon as her body's signals reached her brain, gently pushing Naruto away to the blonde's bewilderment. She loved the blonde's presence and embrace, but he was too warm. The atmosphere between the two was not negatively impacted by that minor incident. Despite the fact that we have only been friends for a few short hours. I feel like I've known him for my entire life already. Since their masks, acts, and defenses were absent tonight, they felt a strong sense of connection when their eyes met again. The two kindred spirits wondered, is this how having a real friend feels like? They didn't notice when they fell asleep next to each other. They just stared up at the sky for the remainder of the night. Beep. Stupid clock, arg. Beep. The sun hasn't risen yet. Beep. Why did we set the dumb clock at all? Beep. All right, I'm awake. Kazushi sat up and tried to find the clock. When I get my hands on that clock it's going to paw euro wait a euro clock. I didn't set any alarm clocks? Kazushi was fully awake now and jumped to attention when an alarm went off a euro. Not the, wake up, kind, but rather the, there's a problem, kind. Their room's wall was covered in invisible seals, but what was visible was a map of the entire floating structure, with the main door glowing slightly green, as if it had been left open for too long. Strangely, Miyuki and I haven't opened that door since we found that boy. Only Miyuki, I, and our daughter could have opened that door. The others keyed into the door had all gone missing. Kazushi moved quickly to a small circle at the bottom right of the map and focused some of his energy on it, causing a scroll to appear in his hands. He unrolled the scroll with unsteady hands. Record of access. Main mansion doors. Recent 24 hours. Kushina Uzumaki, 6 hours ago. As he ran to his wife's sleeping body and shook her body, tears began to well up in the corner of his eyes. A few seconds later, his drowsy eyes opened. What? What? Miyuki raised her left arm and stretched, but she stopped as soon as she saw her husband's face. Kazushi. What's wrong? Without saying a word, he pushed the scroll in Miyuki's direction, and as soon as she saw what he was pointing at, all traces of sleep left her, and she stumbled to her feet. She's here a euro. She's back. She was startled when she couldn't feel their daughter after using all of her senses to find her. Kazushi. Are you able to find her? I am unable to. Her husband nodded, then closed his eyes. A few seconds later, his eyebrows furrowed and a frown spread across his face. With a single hand gesture, Kazushi said, I can't locate her either, but our seals don't lie a euro, and all of the previously invisible seals in the room appeared. The two individuals in the room glanced at a particular area. They both said, nothing is wrong with the seal. Although she didn't seem entirely convinced, Miyuki reasoned, maybe something's wrong with her, something that has made it impossible for us to sense her. Nevertheless, they quickly set out to find their daughter. Her room is empty. The main door is open. Maybe she's outside. In their quest to find their lost daughter, both beings ventured outside, never realizing that two people were missing from the mansion or that there was a lingering, strangely familiar energy. Miyuki and Kazushi had made the decision to look for Kushina in one of their weaker transformed forms that emitted light and flew slower, in the hopes that Kushina might be able to see the two bright streaks that were bending in the air and moving everywhere. As the sun began to peak above the horizon, one of the sleeping couple began to feel refreshed, while the other began to feel uncomfortable. A few minutes later, the couple woke up, one of them weak and sweaty, the other strong and bright. Naruto leapt onto his legs and faced the sunset, unobstructed by anything, stretching his hands wide as he worked out his stiff joints. He heard a faint groan and turned to see Mizore breathing heavily and drenched in sweat. He cleared his mind and returned his attention to Mizore. Her kimono is stuck to her body at euro no bad thoughts. Are you all right? Mizore looked weakly at him, her eyes slightly open, but she did not respond. However, Mizore was a little more worried about the heat. Only Surara had brought any lollipops with her. They had not intended to be taken to a floating island in the middle of nowhere. It's no good, I can't form any ice or snow, it's just like Haha said, my body is too warm and the lollipop melted last night while I slept. I didn't bring any with me. I don't have enough training to cool my body down with my yukai either. Let go, too. Too hot, the half. Their girl whispered, Haha euro my room. Naruto withdrew his hands as if they had been burned, but Mizore passed out. In a desperate attempt to save his friend, Naruto hurried back to the mansion to locate her mother. Two pairs of too warm hands quickly snapped her out of her reverie. Come on, legs, quicker, I can't lose my first real friend, Naruto muttered to himself as he ran even faster than when he was being pursued by mobs back in the village. He could feel tears welling up in the corners of his eyes, but he resisted letting them fall. Two people felt a familiar but slightly different burst of energy somewhere else on the far side of the floating land a euro. Energy that was exclusive to phoenixes. Both narrowed their eyes as they veered off course and headed for the new target. It's him, and his energy is familiar to Kushina's, but something is not right. The doors bounced back and closed behind Naruto, who threw them open and entered to find a silver, purple-haired woman running around the place in a rather frantic manner. She looks like Mizore, and she also has a sucker in her mouth like Mizore Dita Euro, maybe she's her mom. Numerous other things occurred as Naruto opened his mouth to signal her, including his legs freezing in place and a rather sharp ice spike approaching his neck. Then, the doors behind him exploded, and because he was standing too close to the door, he found himself suddenly flying toward the white, purple-haired woman. His hand ended up in some rather inappropriate places, and a few moments later, Both he and the woman found themselves held up by nothing. What's happening here? But Naruto had recovered more quickly, and as he was about to fight for his life, he suddenly remembered Mizore. A rather irritated voice rang out. Both suspended people looked to see a rather annoyed Kazushi. Neither answered, dazed by what had happened. When the blonde's face showed fear, Kazushi fixed his gaze on her rather than on himself. My friend Mizore is in need of assistance. She's too hot. Surara was the only one to react rather appropriately, while Kazushi and Miyuki twitched an eyebrow at the possible double meaning in his statement with blank faces. Naruto was unaware of this, as he had not yet reached puberty and had not yet received the talk. Surara's eyes widened, and she changed as she recalled the perils of a Yuki Onna overheating. Her sudden burst of Yukai broke Kazushi's hold on her and Naruto, and in an instant, both Miyuki and Kazushi were frozen in a block of ice, caught off guard by her. It wouldn't take them long to escape, at most a few minutes in their current states. Where is she? As she asked in a very serious tone, Surara was holding a very sharp blade at Naruto's neck. Mizore's mom isn't human. Wait a euro, does that mean that Mizore isn't human ether a euro? Naruto was thinking in his head, but he was abruptly distracted by the sharpening of a blade. Naruto sputtered, somewhat terrified, Irma euro. She's odd a euro. But then he ran into a problem. How could he use his limited vocabulary to describe a particular area of a forest and provide directions to it? He was taught to read and write much later because of some issues in his early years. I can lead you? With a very pale face, he asked rather meekly. Surara's bangs obscured her eyes, making them even more radiant. Run. Even with chakra and some of his other powers helping him, Naruto ran as fast as his short legs would carry him, like a gun had been fired at a race. It only got worse when he glanced over his shoulder and saw that Surara was right behind him, in her fully transformed state, leaving an ice trail behind her, and that she was pointing a very shard of ice at Naruto's back. By all rights, Naruto would have been extremely proud of himself because he had just set a new personal speed record, but the fear of losing his first friend and the threat of an enraged mother worried about her child took precedence. Naruto stood a few feet away from Surara, somewhat perplexed. When Surara entered the small clearing where Mizore and Naruto had spent the night, she had nearly frozen from shock and worry at her daughter's condition. Her face was scrounged together and pain and discomfort seemed to be melting, and her legs had been frozen in a rather large hollow icebox. Is she going to be okay? By nodding her head, Surara was able to sense the boy's relief and felt a little happier as she experienced the emotion in that straightforward question. Naruto followed her path, occasionally yelling curses as he stumbled, and Surara simply uttered a little laugh under his breath as they began to move the block of ice with her standing on top of it after the path they had taken had been frozen. The two birdcicles had melted by the time Surara returned to the mansion, and they were standing at the entrance with rather irritated expressions. However, when they saw Surara with her daughter, their expressions softened, and they simply moved aside to let her pass. Kazushi thought, that doesn't mean we're not going to have a little chat about freezing hosts. Suddenly, he noticed a mop of blonde hair slowly approaching them on Surara's ice trail. When Kazushi saw the boy get back up only to fall back onto the ice, his mood slightly improved. Miyuki also giggled as the boy attempted to get back up only to succumb to gravity once more. Feeling sorry for the boy, Miyuki went onto the ice to assist the blonde, only to giggle even more when the blonde gave her a nasty look for being able to stand on the ice without falling. However, as he recalled some of the things the blonde had done, Kazushi had another thought. Miyuki, bring the boy here, I want to test something. Miyuki looked at him curiously, and once he simply replied with a small smile and a comforting look that seemed to say, trust me on this. Naruto missed it, and his reaction was completely different because of his unkind past. Naruto took a step back as he looked from Kazushi to Miyuki, but Miyuki simply placed a hand on his shoulder and ned down to his level. Don't worry, we won't harm you. My name is Miyuki. Alright? Although others had attempted similar things in the past and ended up hurting Naruto later, this felt different. I feel like I can trust her, her voice, she's not lying. I know it. He nodded, clasped Miyuki's hand, and followed her. Kazushi then completely closed the main doors and said, I want you to open the door. The blonde just gave him a strange look while a drop of anime style perspiration formed on the back of his head, but a comforting squeeze from Miyuki soon got him to follow instructions. He felt a slight stinging sensation as he grasped the latch, but other than that, he opened the doors without much difficulty, and Kazushi didn't notice the blonde's slight wince. Miyuki was astounded that the boy could open the doors, but Kazushi considered a number of theories before settling on one. With a somewhat weary and disappointed sigh, Kazushi said, I think I know what's happening, follow me. He dropped his shoulders and simply turned his back as he made his way to his room with dragging, seemingly stone-like legs. With a shaky smile, Miyuki, who had a vague idea of what had happened, pushed Naruto forward. Kazushi was holding a familiar scroll back in the room with Miyuki. Record of access. Main mansion doors, recent 24 hours. Kushina Uzumaki. 3 minutes ago. Kushina Uzumaki. 8 hours ago. When Miyuki saw the scroll, she gasped, but then she realized what was happening, and her lovely eyes showed sadness. But Kazushi needed to confirm. Kazushi had received a hair from Naruto and some of his energy in a seal without Naruto realizing it. However, Naruto was a little more perplexed and anxious because he was unable to determine what was causing the adults to behave in such a manner. Anyo, is there a problem? Naruto, nothing is wrong. We just need to make a few checks. How about you see how your friend is doing? Miyuki reminded him. Yes, good. Bye. Although there was something a little strange about it, no one noticed the rather happy smile that appeared right away. Naruto failed to notice the pain, anguish, despair, and strangely, hope that flashed through Miyuki and Kazushi's faces. Naruto reprimanded himself in a familiar hallway, saying, "Baka baka baka." He was feeling a little foolish as he aimlessly wandered around, not knowing where Mizore's room was. Cold. Is it coming from that room? Mizore did say she liked the cold, he thought as he walked past a door that was identical to all the others. Being Naruto, Naruto chose to enter the door directly. Ow! Naruto said, rubbing his head while sitting on the ground and tending to the sore spot on his head. He felt as though the heat had somehow been removed from the surrounding area as he stood back up. He swallowed and wasn't sure if he wanted to look up at all, but eventually the tension overcame him and he raised his gaze. Even though he had a general idea of who would be present, the thought, "It's Mizore's crazy mother," took him by surprise. "May I assist you?" Her unflinching and emotionless face seemed to pierce him, and the way she said that didn't help either as his heart raced to dangerous heights. His hands trembled as he gripped his trousers, and he responded by moistening his suddenly parched mouth with his tongue. Is Mizore doing okay? He wasn't sure why he asked. Perhaps he just wanted to be certain, since Surara had already reassured him earlier. Ridiculous. Years at home and she doesn't make any friends. Just a few days here and she already makes a friend, Surara said, raising one eyebrow, but her mind was racing with incredulity. She raised and moved her foot in front of her, and a single, firm smack reverberated as it landed. It's not polite to simply ask someone for something without first introducing yourself. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto pushed a foot behind him, saying, I want to see Mizore. The boy couldn't stand it. Her eyes and the way her haze pierced him frightened him. I understand. I am Mizore's mother, Surara Shirayuki. But how is my daughter doing with any of your businesses? Surara took another step forward, her once neutral tone now one of caution and concealed danger. Naruto retreated a step further, his hands trembling by his sides as he tugged at his shirt, feeling as though he had been forced into a corner with no way out. All right. Surara's tone conveyed a very clear message that even Naruto could not ignore. If I don't like your answer, you're dead. Naruto's face paled as he screamed in his head. Surara took another step forward, her hair frozen over and her hands replaced by ice claws, but Naruto didn't retreat this time. Instead, Surara looked directly into Naruto's eyes, or she would have if his head hadn't been bowed and his eyes hadn't been shadowed by his blonde hair, as he was becoming too engrossed in his thoughts to notice her. Misery a euro, why'd I care? What is this a euro unbearable feeling a euro? Naruto's hands clenched into tight fists as he delved deeper into himself, bubbling up emotions he had never experienced before. My first real friend is Mizore, she is my friend. Surara saw the boy, who had been frightened and timid, straighten up, his hands steady and powerful at his sides. I'm friends with Mizore. That's why I don't care what happens to her. His voice was full of resolve, and his face was once again colored with confidence and resolve. The boy's unwavering gaze then met hers. Naruto momentarily faltered in his thoughts as a result of the warm smile that had appeared on Tsurara's face. His mouth dropped open in shock, but he saw as Tsurara's probing gaze stopped and she gestured for him to come in. Well then Naruto, since you said so, come in. When Naruto entered the room, the first thing he saw was just absurd. A few moments later, Naruto's mind finally caught up with his body as he stood motionless in shock, thinking, is that real snow? There was white powder at the room's corners and sparsely scattered throughout. Surara noticed that his body seemed to give off more heat all of a sudden, but it didn't make much of a difference compared to the air conditioning the room had. Naruto's body was stricken with a shiver as he watched in shock as every breath he took produced a fine mist. It wasn't unbearable, though, because his body unconsciously adjusted its temperature to match the room's temperature without his knowledge. Murmuring, "Mizore a euro," Naruto settled himself on a chair next to Mizore's bed. "She looks so peaceful," he said, almost unconsciously reaching out to touch her before snatching it back after recalling how the previous two encounters had gone. Surara saw this. What took place? Naruto's back slumped forward as he asked, looking at Mizore. He felt funny. He couldn't quite put it into words. He had spent the majority of his life hiding behind a false identity, so the idea that someone could get past his barriers in less than a night was beyond his comprehension, and yet here he was. Observing Naruto's perplexed expression, she went on. She forgot to bring a sucker with her and overheated. "We're Yuki. Ona. We must maintain a cool body temperature." Surara gestured to the sucker in her mouth and said, "That's why we eat these lollipops. They help to keep our body temperature cool." For a few moments, he just stared at her as the blonde nodded his understanding, remarkably succeeding on the first try because it involved his first friend. Was it pain that was gradually building inside of him? If so, why? Then he had an idea that would have seemed absurd to anyone else, even foolish, but he never cared what other people thought. He said quite plainly, "Surara-san, when I touched Mizore before she said that I was too warm." Surara gave a single nod, but she had to control her flinch at the possible ambiguity of his word choice. What if I could reduce my own body temperature, I wondered. It appeared more like a query that he needed to ask. However, Surara had to reconsider her initial thoughts when she saw what Naruto had his eyes on. He couldn't be, he might even die, she said, but it appeared that her ability to read people had not diminished. "Those suckers, may I have one?" She stared at the blonde in disbelief, but to her own surprise, she was genuinely thinking about it, if tentatively. "I'm not sure. You might die if it gets too cold, especially considering that you seem to have a fairly warm normal temperature." If the boy died, she didn't want to have to explain, "You're not a being of ice. Besides everything that happened recently, I'm pretty sure he isn't a human. Hopefully whatever monster he is, it's resistant," Surara said, giving in to the blonde's rather irresistible and pleading look, which was further strengthened by the large sorrow-filled blue eyes and whisker-like scars. She sighed as she took a familiar sucker out of her kimono's sleeves and gave it to the blonde, saying, "I'll let you try it, but if I see any problems I'm stopping it immediately." Without wasting any time, he opened the sucker and placed it in his mouth. His body temperature dropped sharply, to the point where it nearly reached sub-zero. Naruto shivered during the initial shock, but there was nothing wrong other than that a euro. At least that's what he told himself. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It nagged at the back of his mind, but he decided to write it off as a delusion. "I'm all right," before a hand that was neither warm nor cold touched his cheek, Naruto declared. "Yes, it appears it did." Surara didn't respond, but she was a little worried. She kept watching Naruto and made a mental note to ask Kazushi or Miyuki about this later. Ignorant of Sarera's critical eyes, Naruto mumbled a few words of hope under his breath and gently brushed back a few of Mizore's purple hair. It felt like the ideal family scene, and Surara couldn't help but smile at what transpired. Yuki, Ona once again proved themselves as Surara caught every word Naruto mumbled. However, a long growl was heard a few moments later, and Naruto reddened. "How about we go get some food, Naruto-san?" After rubbing the back of his head with his hand, Naruto stood up and gave a sheepish smile in response. Surara was trying to keep her annoyance to herself, but it was made easier when she saw how Naruto would gaze at everything around him in wonder. After several exhausting attempts at navigation, the two eventually found their way to the kitchen. Due to his obsession with a particular type of food, Naruto had essentially embarked on a quest to find it. Ramen, ramen, ramen. Whistling a cheerful melody, he looked everywhere before discovering a red cabinet with a chibi representation of a long-haired woman holding a peace sign. He felt as though he had passed away and entered ramen heaven after opening the cabinet. As he gazed at the hundreds, if not thousands, of different flavors of ramen, Naruto's eyes were glassy. Beef curry special ramen, pork and seafood ramen, special spiced dark ramen, a euro. He noticed a book at the side, at least as thick as a special edition dictionary. Naruto reached over and picked it up, and as he opened it, an imaginary bright white light shone upon him. His eyes widened in shock and then delight at what was inside the book, and his mouth began to water. The book was actually Kushina's ramen recipe book, containing at least 1,000 different recipes that she had either gathered or prepared herself. When the two local phoenixes entered, Naruto was in the middle of a strange dance in which he was bowing down and giving thanks to the creation, ramen, when their palms suddenly touched their faces. He is unquestionably Kushina's son. Then Miyuki saw something that made her heart tinkle a little. Tuarera was presently enthralled with her lollipop drawer. Kazushi, meanwhile, had sat down and his eyebrow perked up as he observed the rather humorous scene before him. Naruto had bowed himself to the cabinet while muttering prayers, and his eyebrow perked up even more when he noticed Surara begging Miyuki to give her some lollipops. Miyuki was dangling some of her lollipops in front of Surara, and Naruto had begun to embrace the ramen recipe book as if his life depended on it. "Oi!" was his quiet attempt to get their attention, but it was met with more antics. "Oi!" Miyuki and Surara appeared to notice, and they both remembered themselves, blushing from embarrassment as they smoothed out their clothing. Naruto was unaware of anything but his small ramen world, but he was awakened by a very firm hand on his shoulder. Kazushi's head throbbed, and he could feel the vein popping. When Naruto looked up at Kazushi, he froze and started to perspire. Gulp, Naruto swallowed his saliva because he could almost see Kazushi's malicious aura. Kazushi's expression was so blank and empty that it nearly made Naruto reconsider his obsession with ramen. Kazushi finally said, "We need to talk." Naruto didn't even realize that Miyuki and Surara had joined them, and before he knew it, Miyuki had taken him to the room where he had slept, while Kazushi and Surara remained. "Hey, Naruto-kun." Naruto turned to face Miyuki, who seemed to be beaming. "Allow me to share a story with you." In the past, Naruto spent the next hour occasionally beaming with joy at specific parts of the story, and Miyuki appeared relieved to finally share Harry Euro. No, their Historia Euro. With someone after all this time, which further cemented her position in the world. Naruto's bouncing body as he requested more stories at the end of the story, however, suggested that he had failed to make any connections between it and his current circumstances. Miyuki had to force herself not to hit the blonde. "Kazushi and I are actually thousands of years old, in fact we're not even human." Naruto's body shifted slightly, his face displaying disbelief, which Miyuki picked up with ease and ignored. "Kazushi and I had 3 lovely daughters together. For a while, we were really joyful." Naruto could see the happiness in her eyes. "But one by one, we lost them. One of our daughters was too hurt, and 2 more were lost, including Kushina Uzumaki." When Naruto heard the woman's family name, he gasped, missing the fleeting feelings that were quietly displayed by the woman's mannerisms. Naruto muttered, "Uzumaki a euro," and the sucker in his mouth dropped. Her face was leaking disappointment as she stared at the ceiling above them. "We had lost her many decades ago. However, we always hoped she could come home. This morning, we saw her name registered in our logs when the main door was opened. Kazushi and I were shocked when you managed to open the main doors, because it was locked and only registered people could unlock it." He felt it as well. "We never found her," he said, but he couldn't help but notice Miyuki's pained smile. The boy's expression was one of worry as he considered the possibilities. They were too startling. "There were only a few other possibilities left. Hence we checked your blood and DNA." The blonde could see it more clearly now, but his mind rejected it. In the past, too many had attempted a euro, never again. Miyuki knelt down to Naruto's level and gazed at the blonde with open eyes, saying, "It looks like our daughter had a baby. Looks like you're part of the family Naruto Uzumaki." That was the end of it. Naruto yelled as he retreated from the two. No, 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 this is a trick. It has to be. Old man. Gigi told me that Uzumaki was randomly given to me because I was an orphan. In front of him, his arms were waving in shock. He shook his head in an attempt to ignore everything and escape reality. But what is truly real? My Fa Euro family, I won't fall for it again. Naruto shook in his place, tears streaming down his face. With his face hardening in desperation, Naruto leaned back against a wall and embraced his knees while staring at Miyuki. It hurt too much for him to fall for it again. He had had his heart ripped out too many times, and too many times he had believed it. He was overcome by the idea that his Gigi, one, had betrayed him. His Gigi took care of him and was always there for him when no one else was. However, after giving it some thought, it began to smell suspect. He claimed to be busy, but he always arrived at the last minute. He constantly told me that everyone, including his ninja, had feelings and that he was powerless to control them. Wasn't he the village chief, the Hokage? What happened to you, Naruto? Miyuki was a little taken aback, but she kept it to herself because she didn't want to frighten her grandson away. Whispering soothing words into the blonde's ear, she gave him a hug. She patted the boy's hair with one hand and said, "Believe me, you are an Uzumaki, one of us." His torso was secured by the other. Weakly, Naruto muttered, "No a euro no." His eyes started to well up with tears. "Let go, Let me in your sofu, too. Help. His mask was not functioning. He wanted to believe her, especially since their recent treatment of him had not justified this response. Stay with us, we can help you Naruto. It snapped. He let it out for the first time since he was 3 or 4 years old. The boy couldn't handle the pain of his Gigi's betrayal or the happiness and surprise of discovering his family. It was excessive. He was still a child even though he had to mature more quickly in order to survive. Shock caused Naruto to faint. Miyuki put the anxious blonde to bed gently, blotting the boy's cheeks of the tears. She couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him. Surara nodded and handed him a letter she had previously written. First, I would like to know how long you two plan to stay here. On a side note, I can send a letter to your village if you wished. However, she recognized that this was also the ideal moment to ask before responding to him. Kazushi nodded, and she went on, Kazushi, do you know what kind of a Yashi Naruto is? What would happen if his body temperature were to be lowered drastically? Kazushi squinted as the tension in the room abruptly increased. For starters, our powers would be limited as our powers are limited to how hot our body is. Despite all of her defenses, Surara felt too vulnerable. Kazushi's eyes seemed to see right through her, looking for any hint of malevolent intent. Similar to Yuyuki. Ona actually, however, the proportions are different. Depending on how powerful your kind are, the scale would range from 1 to 1 to 10 to 1. For us, though, how high it is not limited. We could literally be at normal body temperature but still create flames as hot as the sun. Surara's eyes widened with disbelief, and as he sensed the woman's fear, Kazushi appeared to continue. He was able to read people because, after all, one learns a lot from being alive for so long. At this point, Kazushi was determining whether Surara would pose a threat. He had to be certain, but it would have sounded harsh. Too many had made an attempt. However, the cold after a certain point can bring us pain, slow us down and make us tired. Kazushi paused there. Telling people about your shortcomings is pointless, after all. Surara knew what Kazushi was doing, so she suppressed a flinch and didn't react anymore. However, a person who has lived for millennia could still see a lot of things. Kazushi measured her response and made a note to refer to later. I believed Kazushi's conclusions were completely incorrect. Instead, a young blonde boy was on Surara's mind. A blonde sneezed while unwrapping a sucker somewhere else. Maybe I shouldn't have given him a dozen of my suckers. In another instance, a powerful entity became irritated with his unsuccessful attempts to bring humans and monsters together in harmony. A boy's profile was then thrown onto his desk by another creature of comparable stature. Then, as they plotted, a grin spread across his face. The atmosphere in the room alone would make an adult shit. After 6 months. Plus. Over the 6 months, he and Mizore had developed a pretty close relationship. However, it was not entirely clear what sort of bond it was. In addition to being young, they didn't know much about love. But it went beyond a straightforward friendship. Naruto was unable to tell. In the past, he had been largely alone. He had made a quick, perhaps desperate, connection with Mizore. Mizore had only encountered jeers and taunts from other kids her own age. How would they be able to tell if their friendship was just straightforward but powerful? They had only experienced pain, so they had never understood what friendship was. They were still young, though. Neither of them gave it much thought, either because they were afraid of what they would find out or for a variety of other reasons. Naruto had learned early on not to take advantage of a good thing. He had already lost count of how many times it had saved his life. He had no idea how many times he had been treated well before being stabbed in the back. His logical mind had cried out to him that things would return to normal at any moment. For some time, he had also held that belief. He had been watching the four around him for days, and if he had discovered even the slightest hint of malevolent intent, he would have left the island without hesitation. Even if it meant jumping off, it would be less painful than what might otherwise occur. However, they had never even hinted to him that they were lying. Only because they hadn't justified his suspicion did he finally pause and accept them. Mizore was primarily to blame. They were aware of his actions. Mizore was shocked to learn that the adults knew. Nevertheless, he had no one, or so he told himself, while she had her mother. She had exceeded his expectations of what a friend should be. But at the time, he nearly destroyed it. He was dying of paranoia. He had gone into hiding in the forest around the mansion for 3 days, similar to how, before that snake woman discovered it, he had run into the forest of death back in the village. He was always at his best at dawn and dusk, but he never understood why. They seemed to re-energize him every time. He had been gazing out at the horizon while perched atop a tree. He hardly noticed that there was someone else standing next to him. He only needed a fleeting glance to recognize her thanks to her exquisite purple hair. The silence was affecting them both, and the atmosphere became tense. Why they wouldn't just leave him alone was beyond him. That first night in the forest, he had been stupid. She also couldn't stand it. Her emotions flared up again, and she was unable to control them. They had become friends 4 days prior. Then he had been so happy and open. However, he had distanced himself over the last 3 days. She could sense that disgusting emotion creeping into her. For 3 days, I was always on guard and would jump at the slightest sound. Naruto was worn out. He began without glancing in her direction. "Hi Mizore," was a straightforward statement that had a profound impact on Mizore. She could sense its fatigue. His voice didn't resonate with her at all. It was harsh and dry. She also couldn't bear to use that cute, "kun," "hello Naruto." Naruto appeared to recognize it as well. It made both of their hearts ache. He didn't know what to do and needed more time. He was too disoriented. He was aware, however, that she would not abandon him. The way she had been searching for him over the past few days made that clear. He wanted to run, but he was unable to do so. Why Mizore? Despite being only 2 words, they conveyed a lot. She was also unable to really solve it on her own. In contrast to Naruto, though, she had at least previously received assistance from her mother. The answer is quite straightforward: because we're friends. It wasn't frequently used in such a forceful way. However, he wasn't experiencing panic or anxiety tonight. He was just worn out. His spirit was tired. The sun had just sunk below the horizon. The place was beginning to grow dark. Uncertain of what to do, he shifted his body to rest on the tree's trunk. Mizore appeared to move to lean against the tree's trunk next to him on a different limb. Instead of staring Naruto down, she had started answering her questions. The words, "Frensa Euro," had been muttered by Naruto. Like a test of the word. To be honest, though, it was to give myself more time to reflect. How could he possibly know what to say or do? He was only 8 years old. Mizore was also contemplating. After a while a memory reappeared. Naruto understood when he said, "I didn't have friends back home. I never really knew what friends were." It had always been written in the third person. Haha once told me that a friend was a person you trusted that also trusted you back, someone that knew your stories. Yet she also said that some friends were closer than others. That the closest one was the one that was there with you when your story was being written. Naruto took in this. He had frequently wondered what a friend should be but had never been able to find an answer. It was better to have one than none at all. Even after 10 minutes, Naruto had not responded. If not, he clung to the hope that Mizore would go. If she continued, he wasn't sure how he would respond. It was too much for Mizore to handle. She was going crazy with anticipation. She was in front of Naruto in a fumbled struggle. She placed her legs on either side of the tree limb. She supported herself with her hands in front of her. Naruto studied her appearance slowly. Her kimono was ill-fitting and her hair was disheveled, but it was her face a euro. More especially, her eyes a euro. That truly caught his attention. He was unaware of his selfishness. He was unaware of the extent of his harm to Mizore. Her cheeks were still wet, and there were traces of tears. What really hit him were her eyes. He recalled their first evening together. For the previous 3 days, he had isolated himself from everyone, but he was unaware of the strain he was putting on the girl's barriers. She was at last at her breaking point. Slowly, her shields were breaking. Her soul was exposed to him, and her eyes were unguarded. Despite her current condition, he couldn't help but notice how she appeared to be an angel in the moonlight. Something inside of him had been affected by the vulnerability he saw in her. She resembled him too much. He had previously gazed into his reflection's eyes. Her eyes were too alike. His heart seemed to have discovered a new key that could open it. In an instant, his own defenses collapsed. In a moment, he had embraced Mizore tightly, similar to how hers had buried into his. His head had buried into her shoulder. He had wrapped his arms around her, fearing that she would vanish, just as Mizore had done. "We'll always be friends, right?" She needed to be sure of in order to rest her mind. He had spoken on their behalf, saying, "We'll always be friends, no matter what. It's a promise." Their hearts had desired the same thing at that precise moment. Although not intended, what had occurred was greatly appreciated. They had discovered someone else who could actually relate to what had happened. Naruto was jolted out of his reverie by a sharp pain that occurred to him once more. Mizore laughed and put some healing ointment on Naruto, saying, "Ow." It seems that some of the attacks were too powerful for Naruto to fully absorb, and there were also some that even his extraordinary healing was unable to stop. In all honesty, he had gone through a lot worse without saying a word, but he wanted to hear her laugh as much as possible. Right now, Naruto had a sucker in his mouth, which made matters worse by impairing his ability to heal. But since he didn't want to hurt Mizore, he thought it was worthwhile. However, he could still recall Kazushi's response when he discovered he was sucking a Yuki, Ona's sucker. It had gone far more smoothly than he had anticipated. Despite his directness, Kazushi appeared to be very understanding. The flashback is plus, plus, plus. In a mansion training room, Naruto and Kazushi stood with their backs to one another. Every few seconds, Naruto's back would return to the ground as they engaged in a wooden sword fight. The mild discomfort, weakness, and pain caused by the familiar sucker in Naruto's mouth were not alleviated by the sparring match. The sucker was then forced out of his mouth by a sudden, strong blow to his cheek. Naruto's power suddenly surged through the roof, and he felt a surge of power. Kazushi was momentarily taken aback by his abrupt speed increase, which was at least 5 times faster. Kazushi's eyes narrowed and she turned to Naruto with one outstretched palm. Stop. He picked up the sucker by bending down. Naruto, you idiot. You're a phoenix, a being of fire. Why were you sucking a Yuki, Ona's sucker? Naruto looked away and said, why? What's wrong with it? Naruto refused to respond, so Kazushi added salt to a wound by saying, you can feel it, right? The pain and the lack of power, like something is missing. Answer me, Naruto. Naruto muttered, I didn't want to hurt Mizore. Kazushi made the quick connection between the reasons, and his eyes softened slightly. He put a consoling hand on Naruto's shoulder and met Naruto's eyes. Kazushi just went on, while Naruto blushed and vehemently denied that he and Mizore were more than just friends. Look, while it's nice that you don't want to hurt your girlfriend. Although she was unaware that someone else was listening in, she had also blushed at Naruto's denials and felt a slight flutter in her chest. Naruto went through phases of denial, annoyance, and acceptance. When you're training, don't eat the sucker. In fact, don't hurt yourself when she's not around. Mizore wouldn't want you to hurt yourself, would you? The third listener was astounded that a creature of fire could consume their suckers without perishing. Then, as she heard what the blonde boy was doing for her, a wave of warmth swept through her. However, she was not as unknown as she believed. Kazushi was examining the Yuki, Ona's hiding spot, when Naruto frantically searched for her and said, Mizore, I know you're there, come over here. The Yuki, Ona was startled. Naruto immediately grabbed the sucker from Kazushi's hand upon seeing Mizore. He tried to put it in his mouth but was stopped by a cold hand. He saw the sorrow and worry in Mizore's eyes and said, don't. As Kazushi politely retreated a few steps, sadness grew in both parties. I'm happy that you would harm yourself to avoid hurting me, but like Kazushi said, how can I be happy knowing you're hurting yourself for me? As they gazed into each other's eyes, Naruto took her hand away, recalling how much his heat bothered her. He sighed in resignation as he spoke. Fine, but when I'm with you and not training or fighting, I'll still eat the suckers. Thank you. For a few moments, the two stared into each other's eyes. The two fell into an awkward silence. Kazushi interrupted their conversation by saying, now then, mind telling me why you were spying on us, Mizore? Mizore mumbled after blushing. Haha told me to practice my stealth skills. With a horribly innocent expression, Kazushi said, that's fine, now run along now. Kazushi turned against Naruto after Mizore had completely vanished from view. Kazushi laughed and clenched his knuckles, saying, here I thought you had no talent. Naruto swallowed. With a very pale face, Naruto replied, let's up the ante. If it weren't for the seals in the training room, the screams of a blonde male would have reverberated throughout the island for the remainder of the day. Plus. Flashback end with a note of concern mixed with humor, Mizore remarked, maybe you shouldn't have done that, Naruto-kun. Naruto answered as she tucked the ointment away. Naruto laughed, recalling how he had burned at least one of the books before Kazushi had thrashed him. It was worth it though. He was a pervert, he and those ICHA books. But as soon as betrayal took hold of his heart, shock quickly filled his face. Mizore put a hand over Naruto's mouth. Mia Mizore, why do you have that para mmfa vera mma ted bua mmph, a K? Mizore said. Mizore checked to make sure everything was in order. She responded as she held a very familiar orange book in her hand when Naruto finally stopped. As Mizore's reasoning progressed, Naruto's face grew paler and paler. It's a nice book, Naruto-kun. Besides, in my village we're introduced to things like this early on due to our short fertile periods, and stuff like this isn't taboo to talk about. In fact, Haha was the one that gave me this book a few days ago. Buddha but it's perverted and perverts are bad. Sakura. Chan would kill me if she found me with that book. Naruto shook his head, refusing to acknowledge his surroundings. Suddenly, his personal purple-haired stalker froze. Who is Sakura-chan? Naruto didn't notice the emphasis on the chan. The temperature dropped as Mizore's eyes suddenly met Naruto's. Hara Yuro her Isa Yuro they're glowing. He decided to come clean by wetting his suddenly dry lips. Sounds like she's nothing but a bitch who won't be able to notice a perfect man even if one smacked into her face. Mizore was not amused at all. Naruto could barely make out what she was saying, and he would have swiftly defended the pink girl if it weren't for two things. Mizore's glowing eyes bored deep holes into his own, almost daring him to speak, and then a thought suddenly came to him from the back of his mind that echoed Mizore's remarks. Mizore went on, but not before mentally adding, "This pink-haired bitch," to her, name list. By this point, Naruto had covered both of his ears with his hands and was shaking his head angrily, vehemently disputing everything. It's only bad if you're perverted with the wrong people or at the wrong times or places. Unfortunately for the two, Surara and Miyuki approached the two arguing and entertaining children with bad news. They didn't want to ruin such a funny scene, but they had postponed the problem long enough. Both Mizore's mother and Naruto's Sobo, 3, had somewhat hesitant expressions when they said, "Naruto, Mizore." Both children watched in disbelief as the teacher said, "Mizore, tomorrow we have to go back to the village to further your training." "Why?" Miyuki interrupted and disregarded the question. "Besides, Mizore's presence on our island prevents us from fully training you, Naruto." The kids glanced at each other, then at the adults, and were shot down again before they could even open their mouths. "No buts, because of you, Masumi, we have already stayed longer than I had anticipated." Miyuki gave Surara a suspicious look but remained silent. "But before we leave, you two have the rest of the day to yourselves." Surara's matchmaking instincts were quite insistent on the last point. She really didn't want her Masumi to be married off to some random stranger. The two children simply accepted their fate and left. A few seconds later, Kazushi approached the two adults. Before both Surara and Miyuki had expressions of realization, they gazed at Kazushi with mild confusion. "I can't believe it, all of you actually forgot. I guess we might as well make it a surprise then." Mizore's mother had taken her away for no apparent reason 30 minutes prior, but Naruto couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Thinking of his purple-haired friend, he was rapidly losing focus as a memory struck. After a demanding training session with Kazushi, Naruto was unconscious on his bed. He would have sworn that Kazushi still harbored resentment toward him for nearly getting him into trouble with Miyuki, despite Kazushi's assurances to the contrary. It should come as no surprise that he failed to notice a purple-haired girl sneaking into the room. A cold but consoling hand touched his cheek, and when they glided over his whisker marks, he purred, causing the girl to jump a little. Then, as he stroked the whisker marks once more, the blonde boy's eyes opened abruptly as he was once again on a bed he had just seen, and something gentle was gliding across his face. He heard a small gasp, and the object that had been touching his face vanished in an instant. He jumped upright, his hand gliding over the bottoms of his feet. It was rather comfortable for him, and any other person would have gladly gone back to sleep, but years of abuse and months of living on the streets had engraved in him numerous survival instincts that had saved his life more times than he could count. Naruto swiftly drew a kunai from beneath his pillow and, almost immediately, had it against his potential attacker's neck and just below his chin. Had he not been startled out of his reverie by a familiar gasp, he would have continued to immobilize his attacker. When he saw his first and only friend, he said, "Nah, Naruto." Her neck was a little higher than a person's head when a knife was held under their chins, but even then, the moonlight that had streamed in from his windows made her appear angelic. Her eyes seemed to waver a little, and he could see fear in her lovely orbs. As quickly as he could, he snatched his hand back and threw the kunai away as if it had stung him. He staggered to his feet and turned to Mizore, saying, "Sorry, a euro." His sputtering was silenced as Mizore put a shaky finger on Naruto's lips. Naruto took in a large breath before he started this time. "Sorry, Mizore. Old habits die hard." Mizore understood the boy's past from what she already knew, and she knew she had to assist him when she saw the sorrow filling his stunning azure eyes. "Tell me." Naruto's eyes widened for a moment, and although he would have likely tried to stop himself if it had been anyone else, he felt a connection to Mizore, especially when their eyes met. He began by gently urging her to sit next to him. "I knew they would never abandon me, even though I used to live alone and isolated." Near the end, his voice grew quieter as he gazed out the window at the moon. "I just kind of developed these tendencies and reactions because I was always so constantly afraid that someone would stab me in the back." He could sense that Mizore was not going to leave him to handle this alone, especially after the previous few nights of sharing, so she didn't need to say anything. He slowly lowered his gaze to Mizore's, leaning back until he was supported by the wall. He held his breath, half expecting her to look at him scornfully, but as he had said, old habits die hard. She understood, and she moved a little closer to Naruto, and he relaxed the moment their eyes met again. She was aware of his thoughts. We made a commitment, correct? I will never abandon you, especially not for something so insignificant as this. He was unable to control his emotions, and the barriers and shields that had protected him for years never functioned when Mizore was around. She always seemed to look out for him, and he unconsciously put his hands around her, placing her head on top of her shoulder, and she voluntarily gave him a hug in return. He let go of her and reached up to wipe away the tear that was starting to form. Sorry Mizore. Chan, it's Shu. Thank you. Even though it was brief, he had to force himself not to let her touch sink in too deeply because Mizore beat him to it. Her hand was gentle and felt good against his skin. Though it was laced with confidence, Naruto could still detect a faint undertone of fear in Mizore's whispered words. Besides, you're not afraid of me. It appeared that he wasn't the only one who wasn't sure. In front of him, Mizore changed, her hands covered in ice claws, her hair frozen, his room abruptly chilled, and some snow swirled around her. Naruto found it difficult to look at the faint trace of concern in her eyes. I'll always be your friend Mizore, Naruto said, shocking her with another hug. Her eyes trembled as she said, besides, you shouldn't be worried about me hating you because you're pretty no matter what form you take. Her fear had completely vanished, to be replaced by warmth. The fact that you still don't despise me makes me happy already. Therefore, never assume that I will. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. You're the first non-adult I've shown my true form to without freaking out and fleeing. When she transformed back, Naruto felt her pain and reached up to brush a few strands of her hair that had fallen out of place. Haha always told me that for some reason my powers developed much earlier than the other children. Naruto grasped that himself and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Even then some of the adults seemed rather scared and fearful seeing a young child already being able to transform. They felt whole as they gazed at each other's faces. Both kids whispered so softly that the other barely heard them. It doesn't matter what you are or what you've done. I'll always be your friend Mizore, Naruto. That night, their bond was strengthened a bit more. Something cold struck the back of Naruto's head, startling him out of his reverie. He turned to see Mizore holding snowballs, and before he could ask what had happened, a snowball struck his face. Hey! He furiously wiped the snow off his face to see Mizore running down the hallway while her nervous and playful expression. He ran straight after her. After running up and down some stairs, winding around some corridors, Mizore disappeared into a room. Still caught up in the game, Naruto approached the door and opened it only to be blinded by darkness. Then a sudden flash and the single shout of, "Happy birthday Naruto," came to his ears. He appeared motionless as Surara, Mizore, Kazushi, and Miyuki appeared in front of him, all wearing cone-shaped party hats, and a plain cake with 9 candles was placed on a table in front of him. Still in shock from remembering what he had been missing all day, Naruto was suddenly overcome with emotion and had to wipe away tears that had welled up. Thank you. He was embraced from all sides. The adults had been told why he would react this way, but Mizore wasn't. She was confused, but since Naruto was able to gather himself in a matter of seconds, she put it away for later. That night, Naruto had his first birthday celebration. He ate a birthday cake that wasn't made of trash and rotten food. He received birthday presents that weren't purchased by himself for the first time. Miyuki and Kazushi had given him a battle outfit reinforced by seals, which could be transformed into a casual outfit with a little application of his energy. Surara had given him a year's worth of Suckersa Euro. Apparently she always had a few years' worth on hand. Mizore had promised a surprise later. It was that night that he finally felt like he belonged in a family. Plus. Later on in the evening. With similar suckers in their mouths, Naruto and Mizore strolled side by side around the island's perimeter. Isn't it lovely? As they lay down and gazed up at the night sky, Mizore posed the question. Yeah. The two were standing next to a lake, close to the edge of the floating island, which turned out to be quite large, a euro, enough to accommodate several dozen Konoha. For Naruto, who frequently led a busy and noisy life, for Mizore, who frequently experienced quiet times when something was always wrong, and for both of them, who frequently had lonely nights when they would just stare into nothing and ask, why? It was a contented silence. Mizore was thinking about the customs of her village and wanted to make sure of something tonight. She caught Naruto's attention by sitting up sideways and tilting her head slightly, She was considering her words and wasn't sure how to put them. Naruto had other ideas. You look cute with your head crooked like that, Mizore. Chan. Her cheeks blushed slightly, and whatever she had been thinking about at the moment vanished with that simple remark. Could you make me a promise, Naruto? Her stomach was slowly being twisted by the uneasiness that had crept in. Naruto nodded and allowed her to continue, paying particular attention to the promise. Make me a promise. She couldn't bring herself to say it aloud, but Naruto didn't seem to mind. Promise me, Pr. Mizore, you don't need to ask me for anything. Not because he was being Naruto this time, but because it was his friend Mizore. He had responded, I'll promise you anything. She muttered the final sentence, no, I have to ask you, I have to. Would you accompany me to pick Snow Whites when I turn 17? She asked. Yes, Mizore. Chan. It had never occurred to Mizore that her word choice would have left Naruto in the dark about what he had agreed to, and she herself wasn't entirely sure what the ceremony involved, I swear. When you finally find the one, you'll know. Your heart will know. The one person that is and will always be your most precious, her mother had said when she had asked a few months prior. Although they were more accepting when it came to more mature topics with Yuki. Ona, a girl as young as Mizore, would never have understood exactly what her mother had meant. They always had fun together, so even though he was a little taken aback by the strange request, he didn't mind. After a few minutes of intense concentration, Mizore put her hands together and focused. A tiny white snowflake the size of a typical drink can emerge. It was a single, pure crystal that could only form when a snow maiden was genuinely sincere and free of malice. She took a slip of paper from her kimono sleeve and placed it on top of the snowflake. A moment later, the seal that had been transferred onto the snowflake vanished. After training for a few months to master this shape, I had Kazushi-san create a seal for me. Under normal conditions, the seal can hold enough of my energy to last several centuries, and since it only requires very small amounts of my Yuki, I can easily refill it. In this way, as long as my Yuki is inside the snowflake, it will never melt. Looking directly into Naruto's eyes, she held it in both of her hands and said, this is our promise. The blonde hug caught her off guard. Thank you Mizore. Chan, it was lovely. There were tiny patterns of the snow. White fields from Mizore's village inside the snowflake. Naruto could see an endless field of snow whites as he gazed into the gift, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. The two slept next to each other outside under the stars that night, strengthening their bond even more. This time, however, their hands were linked. There were two male figures, one with unimaginable power and the other with unimaginable potential, running at each other at speeds that most people couldn't keep up with. As soon as their open palms touched, Kazushi swung his right leg under Naruto and pushed down on his hand. As Naruto fell to his right and his right hand touched the ground, he bent his left, tilted knees and pushed up, sending Kazushi flying into a tree as his right hand bounced forward and swiped his left leg off the ground, causing Naruto's mouth corners to twitch upward. A very familiar voice behind the blonde said, nice job Naruto, but don't get cocky. Naruto turned around, but Kazushi, who had positioned himself behind him, slammed a fist into his face. We'll start on controlling your inner energies next, seeing that your girlfriend isn't here anymore, no worries of her getting burnt. As Naruto stood up again and trailed Kazushi, a cry of denial emerged from what had once been a tree. In a large clearing, they discovered a tiny pond. Kazushi told the blonde, first, I'm going to have to teach you how to walk on water. I can already do that. In response to Kazushi's inquisitive glance, he went on, I was chased by the villagers so frequently that once I set out to learn it, I saw some ninja walking on trees and water. With a broad smile, Naruto explained, I was able to get it down in a few days. Unfortunately, your energy control was affected when you released your Yuki for the first time, so you'll need to relearn water walking. Naruto looked at him for a few moments before saying, I'm pretty sure you can't even separate and use the energies independently. Eh? Kazushi grimaced and asked, why am I surprised? As he heard a loud cry of shock and a splashing sound as Naruto decided to test it for himself. Kazushi did nothing but watch as Naruto persisted in his attempts, getting back up after failing the first, second, and third times before doing something different the fourth time, which Kazushi sensed from his position. Kazushi tried to stop the poor boy, but it was too late. Whoa! Unaware that he was channeling some of his Yuki, Naruto combined it with his chakra. Kazushi threw himself into the resulting smoke. Abruptly, there was a manly cry of agony. OWWW. Please. Miyuki.koi, let's go. Tears trickled down his face in a hilarious way. Kazushi was being pulled by his ear, while Miyuki calmly emerged from the smoke with Naruto slung over her arm, slightly confused but unharmed. Miyuki's voice promised pain, or in Kazushi's case, a night on the couch, as she said, "Kazushi, I saw what you were doing, you lazy husband, trying to take a nap while your grandson trained." Air a euro Irma euro ea euro. Naruto's inner rage was rekindled when he noticed something extremely intriguing during Kazushi's attempts to defend himself. 2. Arrow. Sofu, Naruto raised an orange book. Miyuki's face was filled with rage. Kazushi. Koi. You should have been concentrating on Naruto, but you know I don't mind and enjoy doing some things in that B. Naruto was shocked, stunned, and betrayed. Miyuki's face was cherry red, and she was hoping inside while crossing her fingers and looking up at the sky. Unfortunately for her, it appeared that Naruto was a little smarter than her in some areas. Arrow. Sofu. 3. Arrow. Sobo. Naruto gestured accusingly at the two adults with his hands. Kazushi wasn't without dignity, and Miyuki's eyes widened and her face turned redder like a deer caught in headlights. Naruto, return to your practice. We'll continue once you've learned everything. Miyuki and I have some things to do for the time being. Kazushi's strained expression only served to reinforce the facts in the poor boy's mind. Why, Kami? Sama? Why? As he realized the seriousness of the situation, all hope seemed lost, but then his guiding light suddenly emerged. Although, Mizore did say that being a pervert might not be such a bad thing. Both adults had already returned to their room, so they were unaware of Naruto's shifting reaction. Pay attention. Concentrate, Naruto. Naruto spent the remainder of the day showering in the lake while his thoughts continued to reinterpret what it means to be a pervert, with a hint of Mizore's influence. Standing in a snow-covered clearing, Surara and Mizore tried a new technique that would help her make denser and clearer ice, but it was frustrating because her mother had instructed her to visualize interconnected webs. As he placed her hands in front of her palms, facing each other, Mizore muttered an affirmative. She thought of snowflakes, with their special structure interlocking like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, growing more complex as more angular parts grew from it and connected with other similar snowflakes. Before long, a piece of ice formed in between her trembling hands, rough and angular like a coarse rock. Then, she imagined every snowflake in her mind locking together and compacting into a small pebble. A drop of perspiration trickled down her face as she exhaled and grasped the snow chunk in one hand. Excellent, Masumi. The ice is dense and tightly packed. The ice hasn't formed correctly in a few spots, though. Tuarera concluded her statement by tapping a spot on the ice pebble with the tip of one of her ice claws. It broke into numerous small fragments. What you did just now was wrong. You have to form and compact it simultaneously, not compact it after you've formed it. This way you ensure that the ice crystals are layered properly. Mizore was just stunned. It was difficult enough to form such complex and intricate ice crystals and compact them together, but it was going to be extremely difficult to do so while compacting the ice. She tried again, putting her hands together. After 15 minutes, a heap of shattered ice fragments was visible below. Her mom had already made a little chair out of ice and was just sitting there watching her. After another 15 minutes, the ice mound beneath her had expanded. An hour later, the collar of her white kimono was slightly wet and frozen, and her hands were trembling with effort. For the 10th time, as frustration began to creep into her thoughts, she glanced at her mother and saw her somewhat encouraging expression. With a sigh, she gave it another go, ready to give up for the day if she didn't succeed. This time, Naruto's resolve echoed in her thoughts as she formed the ice. Even if it took him years to succeed, he would not give up. Is he going to be disappointed in me? Her focus was in danger of being broken by that very thought. He wouldn't, she went on, her resolve slowly hardening. He would believe in me. He would tell me to keep trying. Unbeknownst to her, ice had begun to form between her hands while she was absorbed in her thoughts and focus. When Surara noticed what was developing between her Masumi's hands, her eyebrows raised a little in curiosity. With 2 arms and 2 feet, it resembled a human in some ways. It was gradually becoming more detailed. The clothing took on a more defined shape. Slowly the face was taking shape. Surara was able to identify the figure thanks to 3 whisker-like markings on each side of its face. She laughed to herself when she noticed that her daughter was entirely absorbed in her thoughts about creating dense ice. Then her daughter did something that startled her a little. She's adding subtle hues to the ice without realizing it. Not even the majority of the village's adults can do this. Actually, it takes a lot of work for me and a select few others to add color to our ice. The figure's face became more colorful, but the hair was truly amazing. A blonde mop of spiky hair. As her daughter completed the figurine and her eyes rolled to the back of her head, Surara rushed forward, causing her body to sway slightly before tumbling to the snowy ground. Well, I shouldn't have been surprised, but it wasn't exactly what I expected. During their brief time together, they did develop a strong bond. She carried her daughter home with care, handling the figurine her daughter had made. A rather familiar bird flew into Sarera's house after she had just opened the door. She called out, glancing at the odd stripe running along the back of the bird, "Miyuki?" Before it grew larger and lost its feathers, the bird appeared to smile. Slowly, a humanoid form emerged from the bird's place. Miyuki said, "Hello Surara. Is your daughter all right?" she asked as soon as she saw Mizore dozing off while being carried by her mother. Surara went up to Mizore's room and shut the door, saying, "She's fine, just exhausted from training." "So what are you doing here?" Miyuki followed in her wake. Surara perspired. "She came all the way here. To deliver letters. Nothing much, just to give you some letters." When Surara returned to the main room after going upstairs to put her daughter to bed, she noticed numerous squiggly lines on the walls, interspersed with kanji, which vanished a moment later. Miyuki merely said, "Privacy seals." However, Surara recalled something at the mention of seals. "Why don't you just make a dimensional door here? Kazushi and I don't want our house to be in danger. I hope you get it." Surara understood completely. The issue was not that they didn't trust her or Mizore, but rather that their home's door would be in such a precarious position. After coming to that conclusion, she discovered Miyuki giving her a small package that had just emerged from a cloud of smoke. Having lived with them for 6 months, Surara was accustomed to such things and could even recall the first time she had reacted in shock when Kazushi had done something unusual with seals. Ah! Even though her sucker managed to stay in her mouth, Sarera's cry of shock reverberated throughout the island as she and Miyuki were taken by surprise by trees. They were taking a simple stroll in the forest when all of a sudden a faint white circle appeared around them each. Miyuki had paused to inspect the seal, but she didn't get much time as merely a few seconds later vines and branches, heck, even the limbs of trees suddenly started to move and surround them. Vines from the ground and vines handing off trees suddenly sprung at the women. Then roots sprung from the ground and circled around their legs. Relatively thin branches from surrounding tress wrapped around their hands. Then more vines had started to bind the women. Their fingers were kept separated and immobilized, their legs were pulled apart and had vines wrapped around both legs. More vines encircled around both their torsos and lifted them into the air. There were vines binding the women on almost every part of their body. Almost the worst were the thick coils of vines around their joints that kept them from bending their limbs or even moving their necks. The worst were that many of the vines had went under their clothes and were binding them in direct contact with their skin. To top it off, a vine had wrapped around their heads, effectively gagging them. Looking around, the limbs of the trees had somehow interlocked and formed a thick wall of wood around the two women. Even worse was that when the women tried to use their abilities to freeze or burn the plants binding them, they found they couldn't. It felt like the vines that had direct body contact were draining them of their energies. Then everything stopped, leaving the two women stuck, spread eagled in mid-air. Their kimonos had been pulled slightly apart by the forced spreading of their thighs and rough binding, so they would be hanging in mid-air for 20 minutes, enjoying the breeze, especially between their thighs and on their bare skins. Later, Kazushi appeared in front of them, looking extremely pale, especially when Miyuki's eyes were piercing him. The vines that were gagging the women disappeared after Kazushi made a few hand gestures. "Kazushi." Miyuki's face had turned strawberry red, and she caught herself before she could embarrass herself anymore. "As much as I enjoy certain things you do to me when we're having fun in Beta Euro." Kazushi saw this as a chance and a gift from Kami. "I apologize, I unintentionally added a few seals that eliminated the majority of your and my security authority while I was updating our security seals. It took me a while to insert enough security permissions to ensure they wouldn't attack me and disengage them." Despite this, Kazushi had never shown any signs of observing their subpar attire, particularly since their kimonos had opened slightly to reveal their inner thighs and bras. After saying, "Right now I can only manually remove the security defenses one by one, so bear with me," Kazushi appeared to regain some color in his cheeks as she made more hand signals and chanted some phrases. Gradually, the vines, roots, and branches that had bound the women gradually returned to normal and freed them. When they were back on their feet, Surara turned around to adjust her clothes, but she turned back in time to see Miyuki give Kazushi a very menacing look that promised pain. Kazushi swallowed as he made another hand gesture that made the thicker tree limbs that had surrounded the area like a wooden wall revert to their natural state. The journey back to the mansion was filled with Kazushi chanting and making hand signals, as each step either woman took seemed to set off more defenses, fortunately none of which were fatal. Unfortunately for them, Kazushi had made a few more mistakes. For the remainder of the day, it was amusing to watch Miyuki glare at Kazushi, who would always whimper and crawl into a fetal position. Surara merely shook her head and muttered some words of disbelief as Miyuki simply vanished after accepting the package and saying a few words that included Kazushi and Baka. She settled into her sofa and opened the package, which contained a smaller pouch and some scrolls. She also took an envelope that said, "Read me," and discovered 2 letters inside. She opened one for herself and one for her daughter. "Hello, Surara. I discovered some scrolls that might be of interest to you while digging through my family library. The majority of them are ice and snow methods that have been neglected over time, but since they came from our family library, I would have to ask that you only share them with your daughter." Surara took a quick look at the scrolls, and while they did appear to be quite old the edges were a little yellow and ragged she was still intrigued by the prospect of picking up new skills. "We won't be leaving a dimension door here," as Miyuki most likely explained. The reason she wouldn't is that it would pose too much of a security risk, and the energy leakage would likely draw in other undesirable types. "I did, however, provide a method for you to get in touch with us and even call Miyuki and me." The package contains 3 scrolls, each about the size of a small book. The scrolls' edges are all covered in a snow-white stain. After removing additional scrolls from the package, she finally noticed the scrolls in question at the bottom. "Do not try to transport living things." The scrolls are marked Miyuki, Kazushi, and item. The first 2 are self-explanatory, while the third one enables us to transport small items. To do so, unroll the scroll, place an item inside the black circle, and give it some of your energy. Taking note of the warning, she could almost picture Kazushi's somber tone alerting her. She shuddered. "Oh, and me and Miyuki have decided to send Naruto to Yukai Gaden when he turns 15 to learn how to socialize with others." Surara was internally chuckling. If someone lived with you for a few years, they would need to learn how to socialize. That's when she had to repress her matchmaking tendencies. So until next time, Surara. By the way, Naruto included a letter for Mizore. In light of this, Miyuki wants to talk to you sometime, something about young love or something like that. She was also eager to share with Miyuki what Mizore had created earlier today. As she grabbed the tiny pouch from the package and began spilling its contents onto her table, all thoughts vanished from her mind. On a side note, Miyuki included a pouch of lollipops from her collection. Her fingers were twitching, and her mouth was already overflowing. The terrified screams and whispers from the Shirayuki household that day would be audible if lollipops could speak. 2 years lottery euro, plus. Surara could tell that Mizore was giddy with anticipation. Even though neither of them showed much emotion, Surara could easily see the boundless happiness in Mizore's eyes. In light of today, her mother had temporarily halted her training yesterday. Kazushi had just written to them yesterday to inform them that Naruto had finally been able to control his inner energies enough. Kazushi wanted to try something on the 2 Yuki Onna that he said wouldn't be too bad, according to the letter. In just a few minutes, Miyuki was supposed to arrive. She had arrived sooner than anticipated. Surara had stooped to retrieve a fallen trinket when she was startled by a voice behind her and dropped it again. Miyuki's voice said, "Hi Surara, Mizore." Surara would never understand how Miyuki managed to enter and exit her house without being noticed by her or the other villagers. Miyuki was aware that she would never be able to solve the problem by herself. It only increased her annoyance. Mizore had attached herself to Miyuki's arm just as Surara had turned around. Miyuki gave Mizore a gentle pat on the head and hugged the young Yuki Onna, saying, "Someone's impatient." Surara asked nonchalantly, barely noticing the death glare Mizore suddenly gave her, "Miyuki, would you like to have some tea first?" Surara simply chuckled as Mizore flushed, saying, "Thanks, but I don't think little Mizore here can wait." Miyuki carefully removed Mizore from her body before approaching a wall. Then, as Surara had witnessed Kazushi do 2 years prior, she lightly tapped the wall, causing that well-known wooden door to appear. Mizore was the first person through the door this time. The 2 women who remained no longer even had to suppress their laughter. Subsequently, they abruptly halted and faced one another. A few tense minutes later, Miyuki reached into her kimono and produced a black pouch, which she then gave to Surara's outstretched hand. Surara didn't bother suppressing a smile as she loosened it slightly to see what was inside. She then produced a scroll with the label, "Stock," and gave it to Miyuki. Kazushi shivered as he returned to the mansion, his head spinning wildly in search of his fictitious enemy. When she first arrived here, Mizore had shown up where she had been. She had started looking for her friend almost immediately, utilizing the stealth abilities her mother had taught her over the previous 2 years. Through the window, she crept into what she thought was Naruto's room, only to discover it was deserted. Her efforts weren't in vain, though. Verify that this is still Naruto's room. It also evoked a memory as she inhaled the aroma she had sorely missed. Recalling Naruto's pledge. Even so, it wasn't as joyful as it once was because 2 years had passed with only the occasional letter. Particularly when she was made fun of by some of her fellow Yuki. Ona. Would any boy ever want you? You'll be fortunate to even be arranged to marry. Even if you find a good boy, you'll probably just scare him off. Even though she was still excited, the fear that had begun to build up a few months prior now overcame it. What if he discovers and despises me? What if, looking back, her mother had described the Snow White ceremony in detail a few months prior? The flashback is. Plus. Mizore's naive expression met her mother's cunning one. It seemed that her mother had summoned her from her room to talk about a crucial flower-related matter. Flowers. Why would knowing the type of flower and how to arrange it be so important? For several minutes, she had been sitting in front of her mother. She experienced a chill of fear when her mother's eyes abruptly shifted to her own. Masumi. I think it's time I've told you exactly what the Snow White ceremony is. She had to stifle a laugh. Besides, from what I'm starting to see between Naruto and you. Tell me again what you know about the Snow White ceremony. Mizore chose to make fun of her mother because she had a rather puzzled expression. Only what you told me, that it was to help me find someone very important to me and that all Yuki Ona have to do it when they turn of age. Surara appeared to consider this for a while, but before she could begin her lecture, someone else came into the house. She felt the slightest of smiles appear on her face as she turned to face the individual. Utashi dear, why don't you come here and help me explain some things to our daughter, thing that have to deal with how babies are made. The parents would be reluctant to take on this responsibility in a typical human home. But things in this Yuki Ona village were anything but human. Despite being human, Surara's husband had long since adapted to their traditions. It was fate, she said. Minutes after she had completed her Snow White ceremony, I still claimed that I had just happened to run into her. In addition to having no connections to the human civilization outside the village, he was one of the few people who had made the decision to settle down in the village with their significant other. Stupid faulty ski gear. An additional explanation for the high number of unmarried snow moms. Her smile had been mimicked by Utashi, but his was bigger and more noticeable. Setting down his ski gear, he followed Surara. The two adults briefly made eye contact while tilting their heads. Then, imagining a hair that was out of place, Utashi gently brushed it onto her wife's head. It seemed as though a few covert sentences had been issued without any spoken word. Both Surara and his husband were able to understand each other. Mizore had only bowed her head slightly in perplexity when she said, Masumi. The Snow White ceremony is a special flower tradition that has helped Yuki Ona in this village find our other half, the other person that makes up whole. Something clicked as she slowly went over the words once more. Her face had suddenly become completely flushed. Mizore was a little dizzy as she realized what she had gotten herself into with Naruto. The Snow White ceremony is a Yuki Ona tradition that has been with us for as long as any of us can remember, even the Snow Priestess. It is to help Yuki Ona find love, to help the Yuki Ona survive as a race due to their short fertile periods, and to bless Yuki Ona marriages. With his hands clasped around Surara's chest, Kazushi went on, but new traditions have been added over the years to ensure our survival as a race. Because of this, a year after Yuki Ona has completed the ceremony, if she still hasn't found a lover, she will be forced into an arranged marriage. Mizore suppressed a tiny gasp of surprise. The idea of having to get married and spend the rest of her life with a complete stranger was terrifying. There are also Yuki Ona who find love early and bring their loved ones to the ceremony, which then doubles as an engagement ceremony. A mental image of Naruto appeared in her mind. For some reason, the idea of having to live with him for the rest of her life didn't frighten her. Rather, it was more embarrassing to consider how Naruto might react if he discovered that Mizore had deceived him into marrying her. Her parents decided to scar their daughter for life by telling Mizore about their own experiences, with a little visual demonstration, but they also found it interesting how her changing emotions were depicted on her face after they had had time to process it. Even though the Yuki Ona did not consider discussing such mature topics taboo, Mizore found it embarrassing to learn about her parents' bedtime adventures because no rational child would ever want to know about that aspect of their parents' lives. For the next few days, Mizore persuaded herself that all of her earlier thoughts had been effectively buried under horror. However, her personal diary contained multiple detailed accounts of a certain Yuki Ona's fantasies with a young blonde. End of flashback. Plus. 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 She used her hands to steady her trembling head and took a few soothing breaths, but the extra oxygen had the exact opposite effect of what she had hoped for. What if he thinks I tricked him? She asked the blonde that night. She hadn't been entirely clear about what she had asked of her, so any more thoughts that might have made her even more terrified were quickly discarded as she heard the room door creak open, and she was suddenly hidden. His trained eyes scanned his room, and he was almost certain that nothing strange was there when he noticed a single strand of purple hair on the floor. He was reminded of what Kazushi had told him about today, and he suppressed a growing smile as he continued to act as natural as possible while using some of his other senses. Strange. Swore I felt something. A familiar blonde entered the room. The room temperature is just a little bit lower than usual, which is not something I would normally notice. The strand of hair is also rather long. Last I remember Mizore's hair was of decent length though, he said, forcing himself to relax after bending down to examine the hair more closely. It was painful, but it's definitely paying off now. With each observation, Naruto got closer to identifying the intruder in the room and gradually drew her hiding place closer, needing to use all of his mental strength to keep his sly smile in check lest he reveal his identity. Mizore couldn't possibly point out any anomalies in Naruto's behavior because she had been gone for 2 years and couldn't tell if Naruto had picked up any new quirks. However, what she did notice made her heart race. Her left hand shakily reached up to brush her purple hair when she saw a single strand on the ground next to Naruto's feet. She was so preoccupied with that dangerous hair that she didn't seem to notice that her target had vanished, that there was no one behind her, or that she was unwrapping and sucking a familiar sucker. She did notice, though, when the person behind her spoke. Oh no. She practically leapt out of her skin as she shot up, forgetting that she was crouching on a tree outside the blonde's room window. It was a soft whisper, but it was harsh and sharp. Naruto-kun. Her body was angled strangely, with one leg hanging below her and another hooked onto the tree she was on. Both arms hanging in front of her still in bracing position, her body bent at the stomach, and her eyes still closed. She only saw a glimpse of her blonde hair before two cozy, warm arms suddenly warped around her torso as she tried to turn around, causing her leg to hit air and causing her body to fall while rotating sideways. Naruto whispered softly into her ear, "Long time no see Mizore-chan." Although it was quite an accomplishment given that he felt like he had just run 20 marathons with a pack of serious Kazushi chasing after him. The worst part was that some of them probably did get him. He had chosen to disregard his grandfather's warnings that the more power he had, the greater the drain and the worse the pain, but the skills he had learned helped him effectively cover up the amount of strength he had to use. Mizore's heart skipped a beat when she looked up and saw Naruto staring at her from above. Blood rushed to her cheeks as she verified the boy's identity with her own eyes. As he lifted her gently and placed her on the branch beside him, Mizore could feel his firm yet warm hands. She wanted to feel them on her skin, but before long, they vanished and she was left staring at him. Both Mizore and Naruto had grown a little taller, though Mizore was a little taller than Naruto, which embarrassed him. Mizore giggled quietly as Naruto appeared to try to will himself taller, and for a brief moment, she forgot her concerns. "Would you like to take a stroll, Mizore-chan?" In an effort to avoid embarrassing himself further, Naruto quickly stopped trying to grow taller. Mizore nodded softly, but before she could jump, Naruto's arms warped around her again, causing her to forget to move her own legs. Fortunately, Naruto's powerful arms gave her more than enough support as she leaned into his arms. A particular egg pulsed in another room, and the surrounding seals glowed red, indicating that the seals were at their breaking point. Naruto could sense the awkwardness that enveloped them both, but he wasn't exactly a social worker, and Mizore was too preoccupied with her terrifying thoughts to notice much or that the awkward silence was likely her doing. This walk felt different from the others they had taken together. It wasn't a straightforward and contented silence. After taking a deep, deliberate breath, Naruto was eventually spared from having to break the silence. "Naruto, you remember that promise 2 years ago?" she said, wringing her hands nervously. How could Mizore-chan have slipped my mind? His eyes narrowed as he paused and turned to face Mizore, who was staring at the ground below, which seemed suddenly much more interesting. Though Naruto's gaze was drawn to her mouth as she moistened her suddenly parched mouth, she appeared to become more solemn at this point. "You promised to pick Snow Whites with me," she whispered softly. She had to change the subject immediately because she was becoming anxious and couldn't stand it any longer. "Would you like to go for a walk to that pond, Naruto-kun?" she added. The first other thing that sprang to mind was frustration. Why couldn't she ask what she truly wanted? Naruto just nodded, folded his arms behind his head, and jumped off the tree with Mizore at his side. Naruto would occasionally point at our belongings, but she would just nod, finding it difficult to formulate her next question. She was relieved that the walk was a diversion. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel tiny beads of cold sweat rolling down the back of her neck, but she interrupted herself before she even started, saying, "What a euro." They had already arrived at the pond, and fortunately Naruto didn't seem to notice her small, half-formed question. Naruto had plopped himself down beside a tree, and when their gazes met again, this was it. She took a deep breath and mentally recited the question. "What kind of girl would you want to spend the rest of your life with, Naruto-kun, if you had to marry me?" Mizore had to force herself not to flinch because it was too difficult to ask the actual question. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the emotionless expression on Mizore's face, and strangely, he raised his right hand to his chin while closing both of his eyes. He never really gave it much thought because, after all, he didn't see the need to think about so many things so soon after Kazushi had informed him that he would likely live for a very long time. "In any case, I would like a girl who accepts me for who I am, flaws and all." As he spoke, his gaze shifted to the horizon, where the golden glow of the setting sun was magnificent. "If I ever crossed the line, she would be able to stop me. No matter what I did, she would support me and pull me back if I ever fell. I could continue, but I suppose I would have to feel it with my heart to know in the end." His eyes had landed on the girl next to him when he suddenly realized, someone like you, Mizore. Sadly for the poor purple-haired girl, every time Naruto said, she would be able to stop him, or, she would be able to stop him. Based on what she had seen of Kazushi and Miyuki, and assuming that Naruto was of the same race as them, she wouldn't even be able to hold a candle to him. "I'm not strong enough to pull him back." Mizore's heart sank, but she refused to show it. They were right, I'll never find a boy. I'm too weak. It felt like a knife had been stabbed into her heart as the cruel taunts of her fellow Yuki Onna reverbed in her head. Naruto hadn't lagged for the past 2 years. Kazushi had taught him many fighting-related practical skills, but Miyuki had chosen to teach him many things that had less to do with fighting, like reading others. He could tell Mizore was depressed just by looking at her quivering eyes. But for heaven's sake, he couldn't figure it out, so he just followed Miyuki's advice despite his inexperience. Mizore didn't anticipate being surrounded by 2 powerful arms. "Shush. Mizore, don't be depressed." She struggled a little, half-heartedly, to break Naruto's hold on her, but it didn't work, and she knew that if she waited a few more seconds, she wouldn't be able to stop crying. She raised her hands to grasp something, grabbing onto Naruto's shirt to help bring her back to reality. Some seals were broken, something pulsed in the mansion, and Kazushi hadn't discovered all the mistakes he'd made that day. A sudden burst of hot Yuki washed over them, preventing them from continuing. Naruto wasn't particularly affected, but he did notice the young girl fall to her knees, and his heart pounded. The area around them appeared to be slightly singed. "Mizore. Are you okay, Mizore-chan?" Naruto jumped to the task and focused on making the energy that was racing towards them his own. He knelt behind Mizore and pulled her body into his body being the only thing between her and the fiery energy, before she could respond. A groan echoed through the forest, and she was able to concentrate a little thanks to Naruto's reprieve, at which point one of her mother's lessons became apparent. In the event that you run the risk of overheating, since snow and ice depend on your body temperature, you won't be able to create either. On the other hand, you can use your Yuki to gradually cool your body if you concentrate on it. But because this technique is so demanding, there's a chance of running out of Yuki quickly. She recalled that the first time she tried, she had passed out. Her mother's words went through her, and she was able to sufficiently lower her core temperature. Just before the next wave of fiery energy struck, she covered parts of herself with ice. To her dismay, another wave that had piggybacked on the previous one had caught Naruto off guard and quickly melted any ice she had formed. However, the thought that Naruto had intervened to protect her consumed her thoughts the entire time, and she was unable to concentrate enough to reform her ice. The area around them was on fire. With his heart clenched, Naruto was also worried, but not for himself. The extra energy he was absorbing was causing the sucker in his mouth to melt much more quickly than usual, and he was unprepared for the 3 energy bursts that had swept through the island at once. As the fire roared around them, Mizore's agonized gasp froze him, causing his arms to shake and his eyes to widen. It was painful to watch Mizore begin to collapse, just as she had the first time the sun had risen, her breathing becoming labored as she began to soak her kimono. Why was breathing suddenly so difficult? Thinking quickly, Naruto grabbed 2 more lollipops from a seal he had on his arm and began to suck on them. The first one had already melted, and the other 2 were well on their way. Placing Mizore on his back to protect her from any more pulses, he ran for the adults, his legs more exhausted than usual, the cold really getting to him. He tightened his grip on Mizore's calves behind him and accelerated with a boost in strength, his ability to concentrate. He was taking in as much as he could, and as the fire seemed to close in around them, the suckers in his mouth melted even more quickly. It was only a matter of time now. He leapt into his room, but to his horror, he just realized that the pulses appeared to be coming from somewhere within the mansion as another wave of hot energy appeared, speeding towards him through the walls. He hadn't studied Fuinjutsu, 3, or barrier techniques, so he wouldn't be able to draw a temporary barrier for Mizore. A numbness spread throughout his body, but he didn't drop her. Each pulse caused the seals surrounding them to glow yellow. Then he had an idea, and if his hands hadn't been on Mizore, he would have slapped himself for not thinking of it sooner. He mentally guided a few fire clones, devoid of hand seals, to form a circle around him and Mizore, temporarily shielding them from the waves of fiery energy. A few more waves arrived, but were absorbed by the clones, increasing their energy reserves. He sent out a few tendrils of chakra to a nearby seal, and in a matter of seconds, the room temperature dropped enough for Mizore to recuperate more easily. He was able to breathe easily once more, and he cupped his sweaty face in relief. Their eyes met, and he felt an inexplicable urge ignite inside of him. All Mizore could see was Naruto's head leaning in. Kazushi was standing in the circle with them when his room door suddenly flew open, and before either child could ask what was happening, Kazushi pulled them up. Mizore clings to Naruto, and Naruto clings to me. There isn't time to elaborate. They were in a familiar room in the basement, both of them using his speed technique, which Naruto had not yet mastered because of his imperfect control over his powers, but there was something different about the seals. Even phoenixes had their limits, though, and Miyuki was at the side of the room with both hands on the wall. The seals on the wall were glowing orange with hints of red. They were on the verge of breaking, but Miyuki was continuously draining the energy from them and putting it into her own body. Be quick. Before my body becomes overburdened, I can't take in much more. It's going to blow up. Even we're going to have problems here, Miyuki had yelled, her voice clearly strained. The entire space was collapsing. Some sections of the room had already begun to crumble. Mizore hurried to her mother's side, who was standing next to the dimensional door that would take them back to their home. She paused, took Naruto's hand, and then looked him in the eyes. Naruto smiled at her with pain, and she felt the hands pushing her back. No one shut the door when they crossed over this time. The last words Mizore heard stuck in her head, especially since Naruto was still grinning as if nothing was wrong. She could see Naruto's outstretched form pointing at her. I'll be fine, Mizore, he said. It's unsafe here. Go home. We'll both be all right, I swear. Everything was silent, deathly so, until a loud explosion abruptly blocked out what she could see outside the door. The last thing she saw would haunt her. Naruto was too preoccupied with ensuring that she and her mother had survived, and although he didn't appear to need to follow them, she was certain that he wasn't supposed to be hurt. A few pieces of debris had caught him off guard, and one rather sharp piece had sliced into his right arm. Moments later, a sizable portion of what had been the room's ceiling had fallen on his back. The worst part was that a sharp edge of the falling part had somehow speared him through his stomach. Her eyes watered as adrenaline surged through her body, and she began to fight to reach her Naruto-kun, to remain by his side. A black seal had appeared on both doors, which had suddenly closed shut. The seal was made to activate when either end of the tunnel was exposed to danger. It wouldn't be good if dimensional travel was interrupted. Her mother had resorted to pulling her back, but as soon as they approached their door at the end of the tunnel, a force suddenly threw them back. The door vanished just as Mizore threw herself at it. The image of Naruto's smile would haunt her, even though she was numb and unable to feel anything. She collapsed on the floor, appearing to be boneless, and tears fell on her hands as she stared aimlessly off to the side. Despite Naruto's smile, Mizore knew. After all, she had worn a mask herself, so the fake smile didn't fool her for a second. Her mother, who hadn't done this since she first met Naruto, was picking her up and pressing her head against her chest. Once more, she had allowed them to reach her. How come she couldn't simply keep them out? Perhaps it's because they were correct, she pondered. Squeezing her eyes shut, she suppressed her tears. She vowed never to cry again. She inhaled deeply and held it. She opened them once more after realizing that she wouldn't cry. She had one silver phoenix in her hand. She could feel the tears welling up again. She was unable to resist. Not after that day a few months ago, in particular. Something cold was wrapped around her hand when she eventually regained consciousness after Naruto had pushed her out. It was a plain necklace made of silver with intertwining chains. A tiny phoenix hung at the end. The phoenix's blue eyes and snowflakes etched on either side were its most peculiar features. She was most struck by those features, though. She was unable to resist. He was likely the only person she would ever want because he was the only one who had ever understood her. Now he was gone. She had foolishly harassed her mother for days following the accident, not believing what she was seeing. She didn't pause to reflect. Didn't she realize this wasn't amusing? Once more, Mizore was by her mother's side. She'd tried, she'd told her. Her mom had already made an attempt. She had pulled out a random scroll that Kazushi had given her. Miyuki was the one she had used. It didn't work when she put her Yuki in. Rather, before the scroll broke apart in front of her, the seals had pulsed. She was afraid to try the other scroll. She was unable to accept it. I thought it was all a bad dream. She was no longer able to tell. Her heart tightened with every second her daughter tormented her. Her daughter, though, had come to terms with it. She had not lost nearly as much as she had. Her vision was suddenly filled with snow, and she was hit and sent flying before she knew it. She was bleeding, and she put her hand to her left ribs. Her own daughter had hit her, and her eyes grew wide with shock. She winced as she looked up. Because of the pain, in part. Primarily because of her daughter's appearance. Mizore appeared to be broken. Losing her first genuine relationship with someone outside of her family had been too much, as she could see in her eyes. Her face was dejected, but her eyes appeared empty. Her heart had a hole in it, a rift that would most likely never completely close. A necklace was clenched in her daughter's right fist. In her monster form, Mizore was slowly approaching her mother, prepared to strike her until she stopped lying to her. She didn't cry. Her mother's face was frozen in shock as she lay on the ground. Strangely enough, though, Mizore hardly flinched. Raising her hand, Mizore was ready to drop her sharpening hand on her mother. Before she knew it, she was lying on the ground. Beside her, her ice blade broke. Her tenuous hold on reality weakened even more. She had been hit down by her own mother. She tried to get back up so she could gut her mother. However, she was kicked and her back struck a tree, stopping her battle cry before it even started. Why? She reclined on her side. Her gaze shifted to her mom. She couldn't read her guarded face. Her eyes, however, were far too open. She was frozen in place by the tears streaming down her mother's icy face. The front of her kimono lifted her up. Except for her mother's eyes, her eyes darted all over the place. Surara felt pain in her heart. Something about her seemed to be decaying. Mizore's expression was one of complete hopelessness and treachery, but no tears were shed. Her mask would shatter if she continued. The cracks were too obvious for Mizore to ignore. As far as she could recall, her mother was always in complete control of her feelings. What's the issue? A strange pulse ran through her. Was it isolation? Her heart simply would not accept it, and she had no idea why. She raised her hand and tried to use her ice claws to pierce her mother. Her mother's eyes hardened once more before she could raise her hand more than an inch. Her stomach was struck by a single fist covered in hard ice. The agony was excruciating. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. With those last words, she could only watch as her mother's tearful face turned and she walked away. Think Mizore, think. She had been turned away from her by her mother. She lay on the snowy ground, limp. Her face was being whipped by the chilly wind. She felt as though the vibrant environment mocked her. She lost sight of the lovely flowers and the sound of small animals running around. Her unsteady mind slipped away. Had her mother simply left her? Would she be by herself? So why did her mom cry? For her? Her body was too numb to feel anything, so she could only lie there. Her eyes were not even watering. She was only able to see the necklace she was still holding. She took her diary out from under her pillow. Months had passed, and although her hands were no longer shaking, her eyes were still trembling. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, isn't that right? She took a piece of paper out of the diary's back and unfolded it. It was Naruto's initial letter to her. She had read it before, and it would not be the last time. Her heart ached and her mouth tasted bitter. Hi Mizore. Chan. How have you been? Happy I hope. She blushed when she first read it, thinking it was her Naruto.kun with X.ray vision. I've been training hard, learning new abilities and skills. Just recently Kazushi taught me something very fun. Some kind of X.ray vision power. Wait, I think it was heat vision, ARG. All she could do now was laugh in pain. Anyway, I heard Kazushi. Sofu was going to give your Ka.san some training scrolls. I'm going to see if I can find some and send you some later when I learn how to seal things. After all, with the way I think I would probably find some scrolls he missed. Regardless of how much it hurt her heart, she always slept better after reading his letters. I guess, that's it for now. I'll write to you again soon. Bye Mizore. Chan. In exchange, she had sent Naruto a few of her own letters. Now, strangely at ease, she took out another letter. The final one she had received. Hey, Mizore. Chan, I hope your training has been going well. Please keep going even if you run into difficulties. It's been really difficult for me to train lately. I believe Kazushi is sadistic. Naruto could still make her laugh despite losing. At least Miyuki isn't too bad, but she makes me do all that boring things. I can understand meditation, but why all that other stuff like recognizing plants and flowers? Knowing what a flower means isn't going to help me in a battle. Naruto could be so immature at times, the way she liked him. Remember the gift you gave me? I would like to thank you once more. I have a surprise for you as well, which I will give to you on your birthday, which is in a few months, correct? I'm not going to reveal what it is, but I will say that I hope you always carry it with you, Mizore. Who knew that Miyuki's suggestion that I forge things would be beneficial? I can't even remember how many times I almost freaked out before realizing that I had taken in the heat. Fortunately, too, if I were just a regular person, I would have already passed away. Despite what he had said, she had been anxious at the time, and the idea that he would do such a thing for her had made her feel warm inside. It still did now, but it was accompanied by a sense of emptiness. Well, for now, bye. I also appreciate the letters, Mizore. Reading them is always pleasant. She could feel the word, goodbye, echoing in her mind and was on the verge of crying again, but she forced herself to stop and squinted her eyes shut. Her hand touched her necklace once more before she put everything away and lay back on her bed. She looked out the window, wondering why she was here and if it was just to help her race survive. She pushed that cruel thought out of her head, and she also knew that she would have to do it eventually, whether or not she had found love by then. The howl of the wind resounded from somewhere deeper in the forest as she lay there, unsure of how long she had been there. Her mother's words, think Mizore. Think, kept repeating in her head. She tried to figure out what was wrong with her, but she was unable to do so. She knew that her heart was broken. The weak girl was just their prey, and she was not even aware that beady yellow eyes had begun to appear from the surroundings. Even as one of them got close to her limp legs, she couldn't bring herself to notice anything as they slowly circled her. She didn't even flinch when it sunk its jaws into her left calves because her mind was still too clouded. However, something inside of her snapped when the pack leader stopped in front of her and it dared to step on her necklace, which Naruto had given her. The few wolves that were too close had ended up tapped in solid blocks of ice, and the one that had sunk its teeth into her had been frozen from the inside out. Mizore let out a single, piercing cry as she released all of her pent-up sorrow, her energy flowing off in waves around her. A shower of red covered the snow around her as another one leapt at her, its heart bursting before it even realized it had a piece of ice lodged in it. She saw red, but she was unable to think. Because she had killed another of them in cold blood, the other members of the pack did not flee. Instead, they charged, their fear having been replaced by rage. With its snout frozen shut, she threw out her left hand, bending down to avoid a pair of jaws clamping around her neck, and sweeping her right leg. Another of her assailants was knocked backwards into a tree, its legs shattered after being frozen. She quickly moved to her left, avoiding another one that was attempting to cut off her leg. She shot it with her ice claws, leaving nothing behind. Its body had been severed and reduced to mush, and thick ice shards had impaled it all over. Her entire world stopped as the jaws got close to her face, but she never saw the one she had initially ducked launch itself at her. Is this it? She asked herself. Abruptly, a second shard of ice emerged from the trees and became embedded in her assailant's heart. She had not anticipated her mother's appearance, so she was getting ready for whoever had fired that shard. Mizore was immobile as she stood there like a statue, frozen in place with ice claws aimed at her mother. Her mother had returned, but why? The clearing was crowded with dead wolves, and Surara could see the bewilderment in her daughter's eyes as she examined it. The area was covered in their crimson fluids, and her daughter's kimono was soaked in them. She was aware that love had been needed, but had she gone too far? She was on a tree a long way away, and it had hurt her to see her daughter dead on the ground, but she was her mother, and no matter who she was, she would never abandon her. After a while, she lost her patience and closed her eyes, hoping that everything would work out. Her daughter was still as dead as when she had left her, and when she opened her eyes again, her heart had stopped. A pack of ravenous wolves surrounded her. Knowing her daughter couldn't fight in her current state, she had rushed off, her heart pounding more and more with each step. Her daughter's eyes were bearing down on her, full of hurt, and sadness had swept over her once more. Her feelings were too obvious on her face, and it would be too painful to hit her daughter once more. Mizore let out a weak, faint whisper, "Sorry, a euro," and then lost it, throwing herself at her mother and letting all of her feelings spill out, leaving the front of her mother's kimono stained. Surara could only shed a few tears for her daughter as she held her, just as she had done frequently in the past before they had met the Uzumakis. Aaa. Arg. Naruto forced his eyes open and surveyed his surroundings, noticing that the room had collapsed and that there was too much damage all around. Upon doing a quick body check, he had to wonder, somewhat amazed, how he was not experiencing the pain he should have been experiencing. Instead, he was only experiencing numbness from the parts of his body that he had injured. Recalling that the debris that had speared him was made of wood, he covered his body in his flames. Fortunately, the reinforcement seals on the wood had broken when it fell on him. With his flames extinguished, he stood unrestrained, save for the numerous holes in his body that were already quickly mending themselves together. Fortunately, his clothing was fireproof. The explosion had apparently carried a lot of fiery energy, which his body was able to absorb with ease, and his body healed in a matter of moments. He looked around and saw that Kazushi and Miyuki were both sprawled in one corner of the room, their limbs entangled, and that the room he was in was, for want of a better word, trashed. They weren't in the least bit provocative, but as he stepped over pieces of debris, he couldn't help but wonder what could have caused all of this. Kazushi gently nudged them away from his wife's body before pulling her up, and after a brief glance at one another, they both felt a familiar tingle. Their telepathy conveyed their unspoken message, "I'll check the seals, you go take a look around." Naruto was patiently waiting because he lacked the experience and knowledge necessary to determine what had transpired. Don't act before you think. Especially in a situation such as this, was one of the lessons Miyuki had taught him, and it seemed that her efforts had not been in vain. He wasn't skilled enough with seals to assist Kazushi, so he chose to assist Miyuki instead. Since it appeared that she was assessing her surroundings, he wanted to try something different, so he expanded his senses. Although it was unlikely that anyone else would be found here, it wouldn't hurt to try. Nothing, a person, no a euro. He had to stop here. Was there someone else in the mansion? That didn't make sense. He used his heat sense to scan the walls and verified his suspicions. A humanoid body was in a crater, and he could tell from the outline that she was a woman. Sofu. There's someone there. He pointed his right finger at a blank area of the wall, which would have appeared foolish to a normal person, but the two people with him paid attention. Miyuki's lessons had been effective, and Naruto couldn't help but watch with a hint of concern and curiosity. After all, it wasn't often that either Miyuki or Kazushi showed emotions other than their typical warm, happy, welcoming ones, and this time he could actually tell from their body language. Miyuki and Kazushi appeared to reel back in shock. Kazushi lost his cool, investigative expression, and Miyuki's breathing hitched a little. It was someone they knew, and that person is either very powerful or very close to them. As Miyuki lifted her left hand to dab at a few tears, her breathing became a little more rapid. Kazushi had already begun to approach the figure, his expression divided between astonishment and delight. Someone they know and get along well with. Then he saw that Miyuki's expression was the same as when she had told Naruto that he was a member of their family. A family member who has likely been presumed missing or absent for a considerable amount of time. Miyuki and Kazushi had both left, most likely to get to the woman, so Naruto had followed them. They had begun to walk more quickly, at first slowly, and now he was barely able to keep up. As he turned a corner, he noticed a door that had been thrown open. Naruto had not anticipated this at all. He ran toward it, spun around, and entered the room. Kazushi and Miyuki were both embracing a naked woman who was between them, and they were all crying. He was completely perplexed, so he moved away from them and stood by the wall, trying not to look at the woman, who was obviously very attractive. She had long red hair, just like everyone else in the Uzumaki except for him, and her hair seemed smoother than Miyuki's. She was sobbing every time she breathed, and even though Kazushi and Miyuki were not very composed, he could see that her eyes were full of pain and alertness, as if she thought she was in battle. He couldn't help but feel out of place. Sana Euro 2.san drifted toward him, and his trained senses picked it up. Looking back, he realized that Miyuki and Kazushi had a daughter who had been hurt. He could hardly feel Miyuki nudging his shoulder, but as he slowly looked up, he saw that Miyuki's eyes were filled with joy. Without giving it a second thought, it appeared that Kazushi was carrying the woman away, most likely to rest. Before he even realized what he had said, the question slipped. Is she my aunt? Miyuki, Naruto, and Kazushi were eating lunch together. It was surprising that Naruto wasn't eating any ramen today, but it wasn't difficult to imagine given that Kazushi had essentially made him quit surviving solely on ramen. The mansion had been repaired in record time because Kazushi had activated his repair seals, causing the beams to reattach themselves and the debris to slide back into place. It was unsettling to see all the trees gone when Naruto looked out the window and straight into the blue sky. Unfortunately, Phoenixes were creatures of fire, not life. Kazushi had previously created new life, but only by using his seals to harness the nature energy that came from the surrounding life. Without plants and with just the 4 of them, his seals would not function. The only viable option left was to teach Naruto to use water and earth with his human chakra. With enough control, he would be able to blend the 2 elements together and create the wood style, which would allow him to grow plants with his chakra. The other option was to move plants from another dimension here, which would be impossible for a long time due to the backlash of the incident. Both would require time. Naruto was concerned about Kazushi's hesitation because, from what he understood, the man was always direct and blunt, so why would he be unsure of something? Naruto. Kazushi's eyes appeared to be fixed on his face, and his mouth was set in a grim line as Naruto jerked his head upwards in surprise. Remember how the incident occurred with the dimensional door open? Kazushi was not one to skirt the issue, and Naruto noticed a flicker in the man's eyes as he timidly nodded. Naruto wasn't sure he wanted to know what this meant, but he could see that Kazushi was feeling sorry for him. The energy from the accident leaked into the dimensional space. Dimensional travel through tunnels would be extremely unstable due to the released energy. The air suddenly became too dense, and Naruto's breathing became labored. My seals won't work until the energy clears up. How much time? Naruto's voice is dry as he rasps. Kazushi looked up, unable to bear to look at Naruto, who had clammy hands and a slightly open mouth, at least 80 years. He was unaware that he had begun to walk, and his grandfather's anxious cries went unheard. He sat with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the wall before him, his legs feeling too heavy, almost as if they had been lined with lead. His eyes wavered as he activated a seal beneath his left wrist, causing a familiar snowflake to fall onto his palm as a reminder of his promisee Euro. Possibly the first one he would ever break. He took out a small stack of papers from his drawer, which contained letters from Mizore. Naruto.ku no heo. Actually, I've never written a letter before. Actually, I'm at a loss for words. Then, I suppose I'll just begin with my training. I've been learning new techniques from Haha, and they were really challenging. But each time I continued to think of you, I managed to survive. This time, the warm sensation that fluttered in his stomach had a melancholy undertone, unlike the last time. 2.San gave up such a scare last night. He chased me around the house while dressed as a yeti. He could picture that scene in his mind. Mizore running around terrified from a giant snowman. The edges of his mouth tugged up in a pained smile. Later, though, it was pretty funny as he chastised him for playing with me. I really don't know what else to write, to be honest. I'll probably tell you more the next time. How did my writing of Naruto.kun go? Good luck with your studies and training. Goodbye. He pulled his legs in and hugged them to his chest, his head resting sideways as he peered out his window, the paper falling from his hands because the room was too cold. He felt empty tonight, and the night sky didn't comfort him. Long ago, prior to the destruction of Uzushigakure. The occasional wind stirred the leaves and swayed the trees that stood tall in the forest, but the sun was hot and heavy on everything below. Wearing gray vests and black coveralls, figures darted through the forest, leaping from tree to tree, causing the trees to tremble when their feet touched them. Each of them had a similar tanto strapped to their backs, and over it all they wore a black cloak that concealed their bodies and any other weapons on them. On their faces, they wore grayish masks that horribly resembled animals. A few seconds later, they abruptly changed course and veered to the left, dodging an enemy patrol. They then proceeded, dodging additional patrols. Their ability to maneuver in and out of enemy formations was almost artistic. They were soon forced to halt when an elderly man, who was about 8 years old, and squads of ninja surrounded them from all sides. The ninja all wore red clothing with head protectors that concealed the village's insignia in the rocks, and their faces met despite the old man's rather large nose and ability to float off the ground. For a few tense seconds, nothing moved, not even when a flock of birds flew overhead. Then the old leader's hands tensed and his mouth formed a grim line as recognition flashed in his face. Root. What is the desire of that piece of shit? His ninja reacted differently to the old leader's waves of annoyance. The older men were afraid and irritated, while the younger ones were perplexed. The apparent leader of the Root squad said, "You will not address Danzo Sama as such, trash." The ninja in black did not appear to respond, but their muscles were prepared beneath their cloaks. Since their leader was not known for being patient, the rock ninja around them all stiffened, clenching their fists and gripping their special weapons more tightly. "You are the third Tsuchikage of Iwagakure, Onoki of both scales, right?" The man who had insulted him just asked him that question. Yes. He lacked patience, but even he had to exercise caution whenever Danzo and Root were involved. Onoki gritted his teeth and spoke sharply, clenching his tiny fists to stifle the urge to attack. His tone remained the same, as though he had practiced speaking like a recorder. Danzo. Sama wishes to give you vital information regarding your joint attack with Kumogakure and Kirigakure on Konohagakure's Uzushigakure. As the squad's purported leader took his hand off his cloak, every Rock Ninja Bar's leader was taken aback, wondering how their plans had already been uncovered. When the man produced a scroll rather than a weapon, Onoki had already been preparing his chakra, but he refused to let his guard down because Danzo had repeatedly shown himself to be a crafty, morally bankrupt individual. Onoki's gruff voice echoed, "Open it. Booby." Trapped scrolls were not unusual. Everyone shifted slightly as the man's fingers slid under the scroll's edge, and Onoki was already prepared with one of his defensive strategies. There was a collective sigh of relief when the paper slid open without incident, and they set the scroll back on the floor as they got ready to go. The men who held their swords up shook as fear scuttled up their spines, and they saw drawn swords aimed at them, the eyeholes of their masks seeming to pierce their souls. Let them go. Their leader's order was greeted with incredulity, but they were thankful for the order nonetheless because at least they had someone to manage them since they were unable to do it themselves. They carefully backed up, creating a space for the squad to depart. They vanished in a matter of seconds, and he used his dust techniques to levitate the scroll toward himself. His mouth fell open in shock as he began to read it. It contained meticulous instructions on how to get past the barriers that protected Uzushigakure, handwritten by Danzo himself, if his handwriting was any guide. The sounds of birds soaring overhead filled their ears once more after Konohagakure had just sold out their own ally. The flock of birds appeared to vanish in tiny flames when they were completely out of sight, leaving only one bird flying ferociously in the direction of Uzushigakure. Saya Yuro. Kushina wandered through her home's furnished hallways. Unimpressed by the exquisite blue tapestries and the fine yellow carpet, but always drawn to the old paintings that hung on the walls, which described her kind's coexistence with the humans on the island, from the first time they had arrived, which showed a group of humans surrounded by birds of fire, to their current generation, which showed a picture of her family, including her father Kazushi Uzumaki, mother Miyuki Uzumaki, older sister Mito Uzumake, younger sister Hitomi Uzumaki, and herself. Recalling how many attempts it had taken to get that picture, she laughed. She could see her people walking and going about their daily lives through the magnificent window. The guards stationed on the walls were working hard, especially during such times of war. Only one word could describe what she was witnessing: beautiful. Kushina. She looked panicked, spluttering gibberish, and she clamped her hand over her sister's mouth, looking her sister dead in the eyes while gently rubbing her other hand on her back. She turned to face the person who had jolted her out of her thoughts, barely catching her sister as she morphed out of her bird form and collided with her. Hitomi's breathing gradually slowed, her hands steadied but her eyes remained terrified, and she spoke once more while wetting her mouth, dry from her panic and hurried flight. There will be an attack, by Kirigakure, Kumogakure, and Iwagakure. Kushina raised an eyebrow. She was interrupted by a loud explosion that caught their attention. Outside their window, they saw that a portion of the village walls had been blown apart, and she could hear enemy ninja carrying the insignia of the 3 villages mentioned flooding into the village. She could hear the cries and screams as her people were being slaughtered, and her grip on her sister tightened as her blood ran out. San, San, and Hitomi departed this morning for our former residence. We're the only ones here. She continued in a lowered voice, clenching her fist as the devastation filled her eyes. Get San and San by going to the dimensional room. After a final look at Kushina, who had already hardened her face and unsealed her favorite sword, Hitomi hesitated, her eyes worried, but a final look from her gave her the willpower to follow instructions. Their parents were strong enough to destroy entire villages by themselves, but she and her sisters lacked their strength. Her legs carried her as quickly as they could, her face was perspiring, and her hair stuck to her skin. A group of Kiri's Anbu surrounded her, and based on the appearance of things, they had been specifically assigned to take her and her family out. If only her parents were present, she would have been able to ignore the ringing in her ears and quickly get back on her feet after being pushed off the ground by another explosion. Outside, the arrival of a member of the royal family had significantly boosted their spirits. Kushina was on the front lines, eliminating adversaries one by one, and she had promptly organized the troops and managed to halt the invasion. She swung her right arm outward, catching an enemy ninja off guard with the sword. In a matter of seconds, the ninja's head was removed from his body, bending her top to the left to avoid a lethal blow from the front, and lashing out with her right leg, the ninja soon found himself without an arm. As she slaughtered enemy after enemy, blood poured down on her, creating a macabre gore painting as her enemy's bodily fluids covered the ground. She quickly surveyed again, knowing that the enemy was still approaching and that there were too many of her own nearby, and that if she changed now, her lack of control would likely kill everyone within 100 meters. Tisk. She opened her mouth to take a deep breath, but as she did, a stream of hot yellow flames flew out, melting anyone in her direct line of sight before they could even scream. She took advantage of the opportunity she created and ran deep into enemy lines. It was becoming harder, and her limbs were becoming heavy. Kushina wrinkled her nose in disgust at the smell as she transformed, releasing a hot, fiery energy that turned the enemy ninja nearby into nothing but vapor. It wasn't a complete transformation, though, as she still had a mortal body inside the hot yellow flames that surrounded her. A true transformation would have turned her into pure fire. As she took off into the sky and flared her flames like a beacon in the sky, her men's morale skyrocketed as they realized the true form of their royal family, which was only revealed at special occasions that were so uncommon that only a few generations could ever hope to see it. The Phoenix was different in some way, though, and the older generation, who had witnessed another such transformation before, couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. Then they realized that the Phoenix's shape was shaped around a human, and they could see that the person had long, crimson hair that shone brightly. Since normal Uzumaki had pale red hair, the person inside the Phoenix was from the royal family because only they had that shade of hair. However, the person was not Kazushi Uzumaki, their fearless ruler. As soon as Kushina raised her hands at the enemy ships, a bloody slaughter began, and the enemy boats, the majority of which had Kiri's insignia on them, soon caught fire, and the screams of thousands of people burning in the fire reverberated all around them. Streams and daggers of fire shot out from her hands, burning enemy forces outside the walls. Even Uzu Shigekire's forces shuddered as their enemy's agony reached them. They witnessed the utter brutality on display, but it was also breathtaking. Witnessing it firsthand was nothing like hearing about it in legends. But they were soon startled by a faint dust prism that suddenly covered their Phoenix, and they launched themselves back towards their adversary after being startled out of their daze. Before attempting to transform herself into a human bullet with all of her strength and speed, Kushina swiftly sent a wave of her energy out around her. Her Yuki and the energy in the dust began to fight when she struck the wall, and she emerged in a matter of seconds as the object in the prism was atomized. She gritted her teeth and looked down as a searing pain shot from her foot. Her left foot, just above the ankle, had been caught in the prism, making it impossible to walk at this point. She barely avoided a jet of water as she swerved to her right. She refocused her gaze and saw Onoki, the third Tsuchikage, floating beneath her. A Kirigakure ninja was focusing another water blast next to him. Kushina hurled 2 fireballs at them, and at the last moment, both of them dispersed, one in front of her and the other behind her. Onoki then launched another prism at her, and she shot herself upwards as the prism followed, slicing through buildings, enemies, and allies alike. She dodged another blast of water in a sudden burst of speed, and she was soon behind the Kiri ninja. She had thought the last time had been an accident, so she was shocked when Onoki tried to grab her by extending his prism through the Kiri ninja. She was a little startled and barely managed to escape before losing her left arm at the elbow. She wanted to yell that he was a monster and use all kinds of other homicidal terms, but she held back because she knew that losing her temper during a fight would not be acceptable. Kushina was thrown to the ground as she was staring at Onoki when a lightning-coated fist struck her defenseless left side with the back of her head. She fractured her good leg and broke several ribs as the cold, hard ground embraced her. Turning around with her one remaining good limb, she saw Onoki floating far above her with an unbelievable smirk on his face. Kushina shakily pushed herself onto her right leg and attempted to stand again, but she was unable to resist the sudden rush of water. Squinting despite the water, she could barely see the ground below her as the waves carried her away, extinguishing her flames in the process. The water vanished in a matter of seconds, and Kushina coughed up the water she had consumed, her right hand lying crushed above her after being stuck to the ground by a large piece of debris that had fallen onto her. A few sparks lit around her as she tried to rekindle her flames by spitting up some salt water, but her barrier seals were ineffective. She could hear the dying screams of her clansmen around her, crying for their lost family and the destruction of their home. She let her head fall to the cold, muddy ground, saying, "Damn, I don't have enough energy left." The liquid surrounding her had begun to turn pink, and she would soon be completely covered in her clansmen's blood. A single tear escaped her closed eyes, and it was for her clansmen. Her eyes were fading, and the last thing she saw was a big rectangular piece of rock falling toward her. In a single second, she released all of her remaining Yuki, causing the ground to ripple and the rock that fell on her to begin to crumble. Everything within a half-kilometer radius of her had either melted or vaporized. Onoki was extremely paranoid, So even though the rock above her hadn't completely vaporized, she was already in the icy embrace of unconsciousness and didn't feel anything when it crushed her body. Hitomi heated her body to a temperature that could melt iron, causing a dome of air to form around her. She had a moment to breathe in the air before the water began to flood back, submerging her once more. 4 Kiri Anbu raced toward her, using chakra to propel themselves and breathers to breathe underwater. Additional Kiri Anbu stayed in the back, constantly reinforcing the chakra in the water to ensure that the entire corridor would be flooded. Despite her best efforts, Hitomi was unable to fight underwater. She felt a pair of jaws clamp down on her torso as soon as she let go of it. Her concentration was disturbed, and the energy she had released was reduced to the bubbling of the surrounding water. The water shark was still attached to the left side of her torso, immobilizing one of her hands as her right side struck the wall, her head bouncing against the wall rather barely. Red had filled her vision, and her own eyes began to turn blood red as blood capillaries burst within them, causing her eyes to spill blood red. Her legs had gone first, and her mouth opened in a jumbled scream as red soaked the water surrounding her. Melted iron then dripped onto her legs, followed by a portion of her torso and left arm. A Tonto came into view and was getting close to her neck when she spat out a fire as the cold blade touched her tender skin. A trail of liquid vapor was left behind as the pure white flame shot out of her body. After evading the missile, the Kiri Anbu severed Hitomi's head in the next second. The flame missile had not gone out, and they were unaware of it. It blazed through the castle's walls and headed toward her parents, leaving a trail of fire in its wake as it streaked across the sky. Naruto. But he couldn't help himself. He hated his aunt because she would be the reason he broke his promise to Mizore. But is that really the only reason I'd be upset? Just because of a promise? He asked himself, looking up weary, and seeing what was likely the last person he wanted to see right now. Kazushi had already explained to him how the seals had seemingly no reason and how her rebirth had leaked all that power. He tried to remain neutral and divert his attention by analyzing Hitomi's appearance, but the fact that she had a smile on her face only served to intensify his anger. Her robe is misplaced, her hair is disheveled, dust is all over her, and she smells like paper and cherries. With a hint of guilt in her eyes, Hitomi began, 2.San told me what happened. So why was she here then? He asked, never focusing on any one area of her face. He doesn't even seem made, just really lost a euro. She held a scroll in front of her, trying not to let her guilt control her. I also heard that you're part human, so you can use pure chakra too, she said. Then I realized that our human clansmen a euro, she said, her voice breaking as a new wave of pain came from remembering her clansmen. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before letting it out. They had made a technique that allowed a person to create clones of themselves which would be able to transfer memory back to the original. Naruto didn't even consider it. He knew it wasn't her fault, but if this was her attempt to apologize for everything, it was a very poor apology. Hitomi felt as though someone had placed a mountain on her shoulders when he unknowingly hardened his eyes and began to look at his aunt in a neutral manner. Our human clansmen didn't use the technique because the memory backlash carried the risk of damaging their minds, Hitomi said. Despite having sharper minds, we phoenixes were unable to learn because the technique required pure chakra, which we lack. Kazushi, of course. With slightly trembling eyes, Naruto interrupted her, said that seals in theory could do anything. Hitomi was unprepared to witness Naruto break down in tears in front of her as his gaze fell to the scroll she was holding. She put both of her arms around Naruto and embraced his trembling body. Naruto clung to her and sobbed into her, muffling his cries. She released him from her reassuring embrace when he had finally stopped shaking. She was momentarily taken aback by the expression in Naruto's eyes, which were filled with determination, joy, and hope. His mouth was open, and his moist tongue was moistening his chapped lips. Thank you. Despite the dryness and hoarseness of his voice, the intense emotion was still audible. The following day marked the beginning of a few turbulent years for Kazushi, as Naruto would drag him off in one direction, only to be dragged off in another by another Naruto. Not much better off was his wife, who was still a seal master even though she taught about the mind and other non-battle-related subjects. It was already incredible that she managed to train with her parents, though she always made sure to minimize her sealing skills. Hitomi didn't bother stifling another giggle as her father gave her a death glare as he was dragged off again by another Naruto. Naruto let out a loud cry of frustration as he gave way, twisting his body and slamming his fists into the tree next to him. The tree gave way and broke apart too easily for him to be satisfied, and his chakra leaked out into the ground without any effort. A new tree quickly replaced the old one, and he continued to vent his frustration on it by hardening the wood with wood chakra. Bang! 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 He continued to punch despite the skin on his fists beginning to cut, wooden splinters becoming lodged in them, and blood dripping from his fists. Oh no! Ignoring the sticky feeling of his clothes, he slowed his breathing, tensed his muscles, and pulled until his hand wouldn't come loose. Trying again with more effort, his leg slid forward, but he didn't notice his leg smudging a portion of his seal. His hand became entrenched in the tree, his face flushed, his hair had fallen onto his face, and his eyes had returned to their usual calm cool. Saya Euro. He pushed himself to his feet, blasting his muscles with chakra as he did so. His hand was torn from the tree, covered in splinters and blood. A portion of his mind seemed to drift away as his eyes abruptly rolled backwards, cutting him off from the conscious world. The air was filled with a loud, angry, sorrowful feminine scream. He also doesn't trust me. She unleashed her monster form and waved, causing a localized blizzard to form and confine the boy. Hey, Mizore-san, don't worry, nobody will blame you. With one hand reaching for her and the other covering his eyes, Sukune said, just apologize to those boys in Katsubo, sensei. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief as Mizore raised her clawed hands and hurled several ice shards at him. Suddenly, a black shape swooped down and lifted him into the air. That blue-haired succubus was nothing more than a man stealing whores, Mizore thought, her eyes narrowing and her anger boiling. Despite the snow and wind blowing wildly around her, she heard another feminine cry of the boy's name. Mocha, she's another one. Where are all these sluts coming from? Kurumu, the blue-haired succubus, gently dropped Sukune onto his feet, while the winged succubus stood on his left, quickly examining him for wounds. In a matter of seconds, Mocha, with her long pink hair flowing behind her, was on Sukune's right, and the boy's focus quickly shifted from the purple-haired snow monster to the two girls who were showing him a lot of affection. The trio's attention was immediately drawn to a screeching sound that soon filled the air, and they avoided the hail of ice shards, refocusing on their adversary because, after all, it was 3-on-1. He was unaware that the flush on his face seemed to only add oil to the fire. Kurumu broke the snow. Ona, out of her rage, filled stupor with a powerful flap of her leathery wings as she raced toward the snow monster, pushing through the chilly winds that bit her skin and swinging her long claws at the girl, leaving several superficial wounds on her. The snowstorm suddenly stopped, and Kurumu's lunge struck Mizore's stomach, sending her hurtling back towards the cliff's edge. She saw how Mocha worried about everything and how Kurumu would show the boy her love as she weakly raised her head, her hair pulled back from her face. Am I destined to never have friends? She asked herself as memories of the past came flooding back, overcoming her best efforts to push them away. Her angry eyes flashed through all the happy times she had ever experienced, almost all of which involved a blonde she would likely never see again. Life was cruel. A wave of despair swept over her as her mind seemed to separate from her body. Seeing her own body move against her will, an emotion she had been barely avoiding for years, finally caught her. Everything around her blurred, and she was unaware that she had created ice clones of herself. Her copies were as cold as she was, but they lacked souls, but their mirroring of her emotions made up for it. Mizore felt numb, as if she were floating in a sea of nothing, but she also felt as though her heart was not with her, like a chain that would not let her go, as she could just make out the sounds of Kurumu's shouting as her horde of clones descended upon them. Her world abruptly came alive with colors and sounds. She could hear birds chirping overhead, water swishing, and leaves rustling, as well as gorgeous green plants and crystal clear blue skies. The center of it all was a boy with blonde hair and red streaks running through it. He was dressed in seemingly normal clothes, but she sensed something strange about them. His warm smile seemed to rekindle her world as she looked longingly and unconsciously reached out to him. His hand reached for hers, his features soft but rugged, his face full of relief, their eyes never leaving each other's gaze. Her lips parted slightly. Naruto? Their hands were only a few centimeters apart as she muttered softly despite her succor. With a few tears still streaming down her cheeks, she abruptly found herself back in reality as she tightened her hold. Hadn't she vowed never to cry again? The cawing of a crow and the raging waves beneath her drowned out her faint whisper, Naruto. Mizore. With his hand clasped around hers, Sukune yelled. Sukune? Mizore added in his mind. Sukune. Is Naruto telling me to move on from him and focus on what's in front of me?
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.